John Ritter sat alone in the middle of the crowded saloon, oblivious to the commotion of the wet t-shirt contest taking place on the tiny raised stage in the corner. John was a familiar presence in many bars, taverns and saloons up and down the coast and inland waterways, from the Elbow Room in Dutch Harbour, just about the only bar on that dismal rock, to the Salty Dog in Homer, with its trophies of hats and t-shirts covering the ceiling and walls, interspersed with postcards sent from various foreign and exotic parts, and on down to the Red Dog in Juneau with its loud live bands and wild, hard-drinking patrons. He was even known in Moe's in Skagway, but he had only been in the famous Red Onion once, and it had been too trendy for him. He preferred to nurse his one drink all night without peppy wait persons constantly pushing refills. The places he was known, that he visited just to get off of the boat for a while, knew that he was better mannered than most of their customers, and he also tipped better. John was good company if you sat down and talked with him, conversing mostly about his experiences as a longline commercial fisherman, but if you didn't invite yourself to sit at his table, he was perfectly content with his own thoughts. Soft-spoken and unassuming, usually quiet, and a good tipper. It was no wonder that he became known to the servers all throughout the towns and villages where a boat could tie up. They didn't know him well enough, however, to sense that tonight his quiet mood was due more to depression and fatalism than to his normal, subdued, reticent personality. He had a feeling that some dark, stormy night, very soon, he would be lost at sea. John was one-quarter native and gave credence to such feelings. On more than one occasion such feelings had saved his life, but this time he knew his number was up. One time he had the feeling that his knife should go on the front of his thigh instead of on his right hip. And 2 days later, one of the large hooks dangling off of the long line became embedded in the flesh of his right forearm as the corded line whipped overboard, pulled by the heavy anchor and the resistance of the float. It caught between the bones, the herring bait pushed back up over the filament line and the haft of the hook, giving him nothing to grasp even if he chose to rip the hook from his flesh, which he had done often enough. It was only the fact that he could quickly grab the knife from its new position on the front of his left thigh and cut the filament line which prevented him from being pulled over the back of the speeding boat. As it was, he nearly got fouled in the rest of the hooks as they flashed overboard. It was a short opening, and to make enough money to pay wages the men had to quickly get the pre-baited and coiled long lines overboard, and hope that enough fish had attached to the hooks before the time they had to haul the lines before the fish and game boat sounded the closing signal. John continued to work with the hook in his arm until the opening was over, pausing only long enough to remove the bait. John had many such close calls over the years, since he first started long lining for cod the summer he turned 15. In the off-season, he cut and delivered firewood, also a dangerous profession, alone in the woods, and he had done well for himself, but now his inner sense of invulnerability was gone. He picked up his warm beer, finished it down, and startled the hell out of his server by ordering another one. "Are you okay, John?" the petite yet tough woman asked. At 5'2", she was only 6 inches shorter than John, although with her heels on the difference was negligible. Betts looked at John, taking in the tanned and weathered face, prematurely aged from exposure to sun, cold and toil. At 37, John would have been considered young in most other places and professions, but his aches and injuries made him feel old and tired. They didn't stop him from doing more than his share of work though, either on board the various boats he worked or out in the timber felling firewood. "Yeah, just got some things on my mind, thanks, Bet," John answered, grateful for the genuine human concern he heard in her voice. On the boat, it was just hard work, some rough humour, and crashing into a cramped, smelly bunk when even coffee and inhuman endurance couldn't keep the crew on their feet anymore. In the woods, it was solitude broken only by the snarling of the chainsaw and the thump of the hydraulic splitter, the unnatural sounds of civilization driving away any curious wildlife. About the only human contact he had in his workaholic life was to be found in noisy or gloomy bars and taverns. He thought better of the second beer, as he was truly a lightweight, and the one beer consumed over several hours hit him hard when he stood up. Having just slammed the last third of it hadn't helped either. John waved a vague farewell to the patrons who weren't too attentive to the festivities on stage to notice his departure. He pressed his usual tip into Bet's hand and faded into the early morning blackness. She looked worriedly after him, then put him from her mind and concentrated on taking care of her customers. Last call was coming soon, and she wanted to get a start on gathering up the empty glasses and bottles ahead of time. John was the black sheep of the Ritters. They didn't claim him, and he didn't claim them. He was a byblow, and the only reason his name was Ritter was because that is the name his mother had put on his birth certificate. The rest of the Ritter clan were wheelers, dealers, movers and shakers. Altogether a sleazy, slimy, underhanded bunch of advantage takers. John was the exception, a hard-working, blue-collar, genuine, nice guy. John didn't know any other life. Quitting fishing and finding some other work didn't even enter his calculations. He knew he would be a fisherman until he died, and he felt that time was coming soon. There was an opening out off of the Copper River shoals in 2 days, and the boat he was currently working, the Esmeralda, was going to be fishing it, in spite of the predictions of nasty weather. The captain was just as hard a worker as John, and all the crew were experienced. The observer, however, was a raw newbie, as usual. It was rare for one of the young college biology or marine fisheries majors foisted off on them, and on foreign boats fishing within 300 miles of US soil, by the US Department of Fish and Wildlife, to return for a second season, and those who did were welcomed with rude camaraderie. More usually, though, it was some young lad or lass, homesick, seasick, and very much at sea. This time it was a 19-year-old marine biology major, a college girl just having finished her freshman year in some much warmer climate. Ah well, what would fishing be without the observers? The captain wasn't going to miss an opening no matter what the forecasters said. With the way the fishing season was being restricted, it took every fish a boat was able to catch in order to keep the boat in the black. A boat which didn't fish, didn't belong to the owner who didn't fish her for long. John went home to his tiny apartment which he lived in perhaps half of the year, the other 6 months being spent out on the fishing boats or out in the forest, and went to bed, and a troubled sleep. The Esmeralda put out on a sunny, calm day, which belied the forecast unless you ignored the falling barometric pressure, which Captain Jack did, at least in the sense that he didn't pay it any heed, not in the sense that he didn't observe it. It was going to be a rough one, but after all, he could lose the boat to for a closure, or he could lose the boat to the elements. At least the elements were chancy, and if he did lose the boat to storm, the insurance would repay the boat's value. It was betting on a chance, against a certain thing. Better to take the chance. It was the second trip out for Morgan, their observer, and she had learned enough to keep out of the busy crew's way. The men baited the hooks and coiled the lines in the tubs, the hooks hanging out and hopefully not going to get tangled. It was a fairly long opening, and they would have time to bring 2 or maybe 3 pulls. That is, if the weather let them bring in any at all. They lined up with the other boats forced to ignore the forecasts and awaited the starting signal. On the horizon the dark clouds massed and humped and piled up, turning the sky dark. Although only 3 in the afternoon, the boats all turned on their blazing floodlights as their crews took care of last-minute details, getting ready for the furious effort about to begin. A last sandwich or coffee, emptying of bladders, a final smoke. There were no smoke breaks during an opening, no breaks of any kind, except perhaps a gulped cup of warm coffee. Captain Jack, it wouldn't be considered bad luck if I put on my survival suit, would it? John wondered aloud. No, in fact, that seems like it would be a lucky thing indeed, if we all were in our survival suits, everyone. Suit up, said Captain Jack with a wry grimace. The crew all climbed into their neoprene survival suits, and John noticed, as he slowly prepared to put his on, that Morgan's suit was characteristically in poor shape as most USDFW were, but even more so. The seams had let go under the arms, leaving fist-sized holes. It was more death trap than survival suit. John gave her his good suit and told her to put it on over her own. I have 2, so you wear that and I will wear my backup. "Don't argue with me, it will go on right over your own suit," John told her, and as the sky grew more and more ominous, Morgan stopped arguing and put the suit on. John barely had time to put his own survival suit on. It wasn't the most modern, and didn't have all the bells and whistles like GPS locator and strobe lights, but it would be good enough, that is if anything would do any good. John's sense of doom was growing stronger by the minute, but there was the signal for the opening to begin, and the next 4 hours were too hectic to think, dropping line after line, each buoy flashing its coded strobe so the boats could locate and collect the proper strings. When the final line was over the rear transom, there was traditionally a moment's reprieve as they circled back to start pulling the long lines back in again. But the seas were now so rough that they couldn't even see the buoys. Only rarely could they see the lights of the other boats when both were on top of the 15-foot waves, or seas as they were called when they just went up and down, with the foam of whitecaps being blown off of the tops. Not the waves breaking on the shore, shoaling and curling, but even so they endangered the Esmeralda. Helpless to stay in the location of the long lines, she was being relentlessly blown towards the rocky shore. Captain Jack stopped fighting against the wind and instead turned to put it off the port stern. He hoped he had enough power to make an inlet or breakwater before he was pushed onto the rocks. The radio was busy with calls for assistance, but the Coast Guard were too busy to get to everyone. They should have postponed the opening, thought Captain Jack to himself bitterly. In all likelihood, it was the end of the Esmeralda. Suddenly, a large sea overtook her from behind. The shore must be shoaling already. Then another, and she started to go down. John shouted to Morgan through the howling wind, "The water is safer than the boat now. Get over the side." When she balked, he grabbed her and threw her over the windward side, and jumped after, sensing, rather than seeing or hearing, the rest of the crew plunging in around them. The force of the wind was lessened so close to the surface, and Jack watched as the rest of the crew linked up, their strobes flashing in the darkness. There wasn't any point for John to join them, in fact, it would probably only doom them as well. He allowed the wind and tide to carry him away from the flashing lights, and in short time several swells were between them and him, and he was alone in the night. He wished them luck, and let himself float, as if he had any choice. The icy water bit his exposed face, and he missed the extra protection his better suit afforded, but he was glad it would be of use to Morgan at least. Tired after the long day, John found himself falling asleep, and couldn't think of a single reason why he should not. Slowly John returned to his senses. He must still be alive then, he thought stoically to himself. He seemed to be laying on sand. Must have washed to shore, he thought wearily, content to rest where he was. Eventually his subconscious caught up with his rational mind, and he noticed something that had been bothering him on some level, or rather the absence of several things that had been causing him to tense up, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop, or the next ploink of the dripping faucet. What was missing were sounds, smells that were so universal to his existence that he hardly ever noticed them, but he was very aware of their absence. There was no sound of waves sloshing against the shore or chirping against pilings or boats. There was no scent of fish, seaweed, salt that defined the scent of the shore. There were no cries of seagulls feeling lonely or squabbling over scraps, no ravens' croaks in fact. The only sound was the susurration of the wind against sand, the dry, powdery, hot sand. John noticed that instead of the moist smells of the ocean, the smell was a flinty ozone scent, and the air was very dry. Almost at the same time as he thought that, he realised that he was thirsty. With a groan, John managed to sit up and began to force himself to open his eyes, which he noticed were somewhat swollen. His face stung a bit, partly from the freezing salt water of last night, of whenever, and partly from a fierce sun which had reddened his leathery tan skin, although it looked to just be rising. It was the increasing heat of the day which had awakened him. Squinting painfully, John managed to start to make out objects against the bright white glare. Yep, sand. The temperature was getting warmer, so John knew he needed shelter, and if none were to be found near, he would have to bury himself in the sand for the day. When night came, he would be able to see perhaps just where in the world he was, or if he was. He shook his head at himself and gave a dry chuckle. Yeah, that was a silly notion. John stood up and marked where east was by the lifting sun and scanned the horizon for something else other than dry blowing dunes. Like the huge 70-foot one behind him, which blocked his view to the north. He struggled around to a less steep part and found his way to the top, trying to avoid the softer slope which he found gave way under his feet. Better to walk a few 100 feet than climb the darn thing 4 or 5 times, what with the backsliding. At the top, the overly warm John, whose blood was accustomed to much colder weather, took his arms from the sleeves of his survival suit, his only clothing besides the shorts, which modesty and haste had left under it, and draped then down his chest, leaving the hood up to protect his neck and head. That still left his legs and feet sweltering in the suit, but it couldn't be helped. Like most fishermen in northern climates, John's skin, other than on his hands and face and up to mid-bicep in the summer, was pale fish-belly white, the fisherman's tan. As it was, he was glad he had his back to the south, protecting his chest a little anyway. John looked around again, this time from the tall vantage at the top of the sand dune. Just sand, in every direction, except were those hills or mountains, over there to the north. They could be either, but they gave him a direction to proceed. Tonight. For now, he needed to protect himself from the sun and conserve his strength. Just because he was still alive today didn't mean he would still be alive the day after tomorrow. Still, his fatalism from the preceding month was gone, and he was back to his sense of immortality, his confidence in himself, and his chances of survival. Being lost in a trackless desert wasn't that much different than being adrift on the trackless sea. But to John's mind, it was a much better situation. Perhaps he was just deluding himself, he thought, as he dug into the north face of the dune to find cooler sand to burrow under. He had to don his suit again, to keep the sand off of him, but if he wasn't moving and exerting himself, the insulation of the sand and suit should keep him cool enough. He fell asleep, hope in his heart, despite being without water in a vast empty desert. John awoke to the cooling of evening, the reddish, orangey, purple sky starting to turn navy blue and black at the top. Already a few planets could be seen scattered about the sky. John started walking towards the purple haze of mountains, now clearer in the rays of the setting sun. The sun was already down at his location, and as the evening darkened, John paused to await the stars. He wanted to get a stellar fix before losing his direction and wandering aimlessly. As the stars were revealed by the lifting curtain of night, John was relieved to see familiar constellations. At least he was still on his own planet. He shook his head again, mocking his train of thought. Still, if he could be somehow moved from the Gulf of Alaska to some as yet unknown desert, was it that much of a stretch to imagine having somehow been teleported across light years? In any case, however he had arrived here, he could survive and make his way back. First things first, he needed to survive. He got back on his feet and took a fix on the North Star and headed towards the hope of the mountains or hills yonder. He could rule out Australia anyway. Wanting to make the most of the cooler darkness, John kept walking without resting all night long. When dawn came, he rested for the short time after the stars had vanished and before he could see the hills ahead. They were much closer now, and he could see that they were indeed hills and not mountains, but perhaps there would be water or people or a road. Even a slight change in the topography could make for vegetation and life, nourishment. By now he was very thirsty, and on one patch of wasteland that was not sand-covered, John had picked up a grape-sized pebble to hold in his mouth, to stimulate salivation. Not quite salvation, but close, he thought muzzily. But after walking all night, his mouth was dry and he spat the pebble out. He needed to find shelter before the sun got hot, and he needed water before dawn the next day, or he was not going to make it after all. Even with these thoughts, John was optimistic. Surely he wasn't meant to die out here, after somehow being rescued from the ocean. Water, water everywhere, yet ne'er a drop to drink, he said out loud, and then he worried he was getting delirious. There was a cave in a rocky butte, a lonely sentinel guarding the hills, which were closer than he had thought. He stumbled into the cool darkness, barely managing to watch out for snakes, scorpions, and other nasty desert life forms, but this part of the desert was still lifeless, and there wasn't so much as a lizard or sandfly. He sealed his suit to prevent evaporation water loss, and passed out on a patch of floor which seemed just as soft as any other part. His last thought before drifting off was that he had done pretty well so far. When evening came, John was already up and poking about in the shade of the butte. He found some chalky nodes, which he recognised as flint. He mucked about breaking rocks, and more by chance than design, came up with a crude hand axe and a flake with a sharp edge, which would actually scrape the hair from his arm quite cleanly. He whiled away the time until darkness revealed the guiding light of the heavens again by dry shaving his beard. Due to his native heritage, it was rather sparse to begin with, and he had always kept it shorn. When the stars gave him his compass, he ventured forth again, still strong for now, although the effects of not drinking for 2.5 days at least in a hot, dry climate were showing in his dry mouth, cracked lips, and dry, scaly skin. The survival suit was actually helping him, preventing a lot of water loss from perspiration. It sure stunk in there, though. He grimaced to himself. Okay, time to find water and have a nice drink and a bath. That would make him feel a lot better. It was surprisingly bright with just the starlight. John could see well enough to press onward into the foothills. There wasn't much moon, but enough to remove all doubt that he was on Earth. The light provided wasn't much, but his eyes were well adapted to the dark. There must have been water running at some time or other to form this gully, he thought to himself. But then again, they had found water. Formed gullies on Mars as well. It could have been geologically long ago that the runoff from storms had carved and eroded this narrowing and steepening gulch. Oh, he must be in the actual hills now. Pay attention, he told himself sternly. The mission: find water, drink and bath. Even so, he almost missed it. It was the noise of a hoof striking the ground, a thump of warning and alarm, that drew his wandering attention. By now, he was staggering, and had only prevented himself from falling by long practice of superhuman endurance. He tried to discover where the sound had come from in the echoey walls of the canyon, there, up that dry wash to the side. He stumbled upwards, following a trail worn in the rock by generations of hooves, and heard the clatter of a herd of whatever it was as they fled his approach. They had been watering in a deep tank, a nearly bottomless hole in the rock, which held water from the infrequent rains for years, the deep shadows of the canyon walls keeping the fierce sun from evaporating it. He had to climb down the worn goat paths. He decided that was the only hoofed animal which could navigate them, clinging to the rock face, only the promise of water giving him the strength to make it down. He didn't pause to wonder of the purity of the water, which smelled slightly of algae, but drank, then removed his survival suit, then drank, then bathed himself, then drank. He used the survival suit's gloves to hold water, and tying a knot in the lower arms managed to store more water in the arms, which he draped over his shoulders. He then emptied the arms, and starting to shiver in the cold desert night, put his suit back on and fell asleep for the few hours left until dawn. If he could catch one of those goats, he would eat tomorrow. John crouched behind the boulder, keeping still and waiting for the goat to come around the corner to the waterhole. He clutched his makeshift bolo, fashioned from strips hacked off the nylon lining of his suit's arms, and suitable rocks. Just when the tension became unendurable, a quiet voice spoke in his ear. "These goats are not for your use. It would be unwise to harm them." John started and looked around but saw no one. "Who are you?" He tried to ask, but his voice wouldn't work. Then he realized that he was dreaming. "Never mind who, but remember, do not harm the goats, if you value your existence." When John awoke, he remembered, and decided he could go for a few more days without eating. Perhaps it was his subconscious telling him something, but he was credulous enough to not discount the possibility that it was the spirits. If it was the spirits, then he was glad they were looking out for him. He had gone for 5 days without eating once, on a self-imposed spirit quest, while hiking out in the bush. He had emerged with a clarity of thought he had not achieved since, and a feeling of tenuousness as if reality wasn't as real as it had been before. Besides, he owed the goats. He wouldn't have found the water without their guidance. He decided that he would range around 1 or 2 days away from the water in all directions, returning to drink when he had used up all the water he could carry, and not going for more than a day without water. Too much thirst for too long could damage his internal organs. His heart could get overworked from pumping sludge instead of liquid, and certain systems would shut themselves down in an effort to prolong life. To start with, he set himself the task of climbing to some outlook and looking over the surroundings. With a source of water near, he could afford to move about during part of the day, and it was safer in the rugged terrain anyway. He filled his sleeves with water and hung his gloves filled with water around his neck from their lanyard, and set out to find a way to some prominence with a good view. John Ritter made it up to the top of a tall hill before the hottest part of the day, in spite of not having eaten for over 3 days. The sun was above, so he was able to look about in all directions, and he scanned intently with eyes trained to discern small vessels on a wave-topped horizon. He was alert for motion, for human silhouettes, for colour or glints. Rather than focusing on any one spot, he gazed vaguely, scanning back and forth, gradually drawing his attention from the farthest he could see back closer to the near distance. Of course, if anyone had been looking for him, they would have seen his moving, bright orange human silhouette quite easily. They would have thought him a demon, though, with his 4 arms, the 2 water-filled sleeves dangling and swaying over his shoulders. They would have avoided him, hidden from him, and watched him from safety. Zithrusa hid as she easily avoided the orange demon. She watched from safety as he drank, and stripped off his orange skin. She didn't think that demons needed to drink. She had scrambled to hiding when her goats had alarmed, and as she watched, she wondered what kind of man this was and what strange clothing he wore. His skin was so pale, yet his hair and eyes were dark. If it wasn't for his glowing white skin, which resembled a corpse or ghost, he could be just any other man, if you dressed him in something other than skin-tight orange. And such an orange, it was so bright, so easy to see, almost if it was meant to draw attention. This close to the caravan route with all the bandits and warrior kings, it wasn't the smartest plan. Even so, besides his orange skin, he had no belongings. He didn't even have a knife. He seemed to belong to no tribe or clan, as he had no sept tattoos, not even a guild mark. She had no idea where he had come from, but it didn't seem like he would be able to survive in this world. Yet here he was, and a man full grown. She was astonished when his second skin proved to hold water. What kind of rare weave was it? Zithrusa examined her own wool and felt clothing, loose layers of fine, thin weave, perfect for keeping cool or warm as the case might be. Hers were the same colour as the animals which had provided the fibres, dull browns, greys, tans, and blacks. Her mother and grandmother had avoided sharp boundaries between the colours when they wove, so she would fade into the rocks better. They knew she would be out here on the caravan route tending the part of the flock they had for barter, with the passing traders, who could barely find forage for their own pack animals, the strange double-humped camels so unlike those that were found in wild herds to the west. Zithrusa had been watching over her flock since she was 9 for the past 7 years, and had kept them from harm against sandcrocs, or varan, leopards, wolves, thieves, outlaws and bandits, and cobras and vipers. She could sling among the best in the tribe and against more deadly foes. She had a horn bow which was deceptively powerful for its size. She had used it to effect against more than one predator, both the 2-legged and 4-legged kind. As long as this strange fool left her flock alone, she had no quarrel for him. No arrow or slungshot either. Her knife was sharp, but she seldom needed to resort to it. Most of those molesting her charges were taken out from ambush, and never even saw her. It was getting towards the end of the season for the caravans, and in a few weeks, Zithrusa would be returning home. Wherever her nomadic people were pitching their felt tents currently as they moved their flocks to forage. There she would stay with the women on the left side of the tent, behind a cloth partition, weaving, playing the two-stringed urgil and learning the spoken history of her people. It was not usual for a girl to tend the flocks, but her people were not blessed with many sons, so those they had produced were coddled and treasured, and protected to maintain the face of the family. It was needed that men interacted with the traders and other tribes. No one would pay attention to a woman. There weren't enough husbands to go around, so Zithrusa, who was several years past marrying age, was still a maiden. Her family was poor and didn't have enough dowries to provide good matches for all their daughters. Most likely, Zithrusa would become a maiden auntie and perhaps provide a child or two to the family, gotten from some passing trader. As long as there was a hope for a husband, though, she was going to hold out for that. Zithrusa was counted as beautiful among the tribes, but that didn't make much headway against a poor or missing dowry. She had even daydreamed of some eastern prince seeing her and wanting her for his third wife. She didn't want to be a concubine, though. She wanted at least some status as a person, and even third or fourth wife to such a powerful prince would be a much higher status than an unmarried auntie. She faded back into the shadows and left the foolish man by the water. Didn't he know how dangerous it was to camp by water? Any predator would overcome its reluctance to approach man when the foolish man was between it and life-giving water. So far he seemed harmless, but she would keep an eye on him and her flock to make sure that his status didn't change to a beast to be extinguished. She was a very good protector of her flock. John found a shady spot to wait out the heat of the day, drinking the contents of half of each of his gloves. He wanted to keep them balanced, and there was no reason to conserve water with a nearby source. He leaned back against the rocky overhang, appreciating the chance to relax. He felt a tickle against his cheek and brushed at it with his hand. Ouch! Something bit him. He looked at the crushed remains of a spider on his hand and had a brief thought that he hoped it wasn't poisonous. As he had that thought, he noticed that he couldn't move. He had barely enough time to force his eyes closed before they were stuck open and drying out. Then for the longest time, he listened gratefully to his heartbeat and his quiet breathing. The man was a fool, she thought to herself, as she struggled to drag him across the back of her donkey. The tough yet patient beast of burden carried her supplies and shelter, and now was carrying this useless man who hadn't anything of any value except his orange skin. Still, she thought as she examined it, it was of the rarest material. She had never seen the like. It would be very valuable, but to not even have a knife. She wondered if he was a fool or just used to having bodyguards to protect him. She wondered where he had come from. His tracks had led in from the sands. Nothing and no one lived on the sands. It was very mysterious. Even a little child knew to avoid the stiffening spider. Its bite only rarely killed, but it could stiffen a grown man for several weeks. She didn't know why she was helping him, but perhaps his helpless condition stirred her motherly feelings. Arriving at her shelter, Zithrusa got him off the patient donkey and onto her sleeping mat. He was totally helpless, and would be for days. After a week, his muscles would slowly start to obey him again, and he would be fully recovered, fate's willing, by the end of the third week. She spoke to him as if he was a little child, knowing he could hear her, and angry enough at herself and him to not worry how he might remember it and punish her when he was able to move again. She made a broth of shredded meat and well-boiled grain, and spooned it down him a little at a time. She was careful not to overload his involuntary swallowing, as he would be unable to cough effectively for some days yet. She placed an absorbent cotton pad under him, as he had no conscious bladder control. After she got him situated, she went back out to overlook her animals, searching for predators and other dangers. For the most part, the goats were able to fend for themselves. It was a good thing she had moved into the area recently, and the goats still had plenty of forage to browse. In a week or two, she would take the stranger and her flock to the meeting spot, and if her people were not there, there would be signs to show where they would be. Rock cairns with surrounding patterns of rocks laid out showing her their intended path and timing. It was so frustrating. John, who was used to being active, used to working hard at difficult jobs, couldn't even open his eyes. It was embarrassing too, to have the woman have to change the urine-soaked pad that he couldn't help but soak with urine. She spoke a strange language that he didn't understand, at times singing to him gently. John could tell she was rather young by the firmness of her breasts against his back when she curled up behind him to sleep at night, and as she held him upright to feed him broth. He was so hungry, but he was unable to chew, so letting the broth trickle down his throat as his involuntary swallowing helped it along was the best that could be done. He was lucky that she had found him, out here in this empty wilderness, he thought gratefully. As time passed, John struggled constantly to make his rebellious muscles obey him, and soon enough he was able to open his eyes, although focusing was still beyond him. He was in a strange tent with a felt roof and woven blanket sides. There was an iron brazier over which his lovely benefactor was cooking meat broth in a small copper dish. As if sensing his regard, she turned and looked at him, smiling widely, showing strong white teeth. She spoke to him, and he couldn't even shake his head that he didn't understand. He was laying nude under a light wool blanket, which only made sense as she had to change that damn pad for him every 4 or 6 hours. He resolved to try with all his might to regain his bladder control, and he did so to his relief as well as hers 2 days later. She then used one of his gloves to catch his urine in, to carry away. She began language lessons as soon as John was able to indicate that he didn't understand her, and the first thing he learned was that her name was Zithrusa. He didn't get to practice speaking it for a while, but she named everything in sight and talked almost constantly. In very short time with this intensive teaching method, he found he was starting to understand her. She delighted in the comprehension she saw in his eyes, and soon he was able to speak enough to whisper his own name to her. Soon afterwards, he was able to chew and swallow his first real meal in weeks. Within 4 days of his first meal, John was able to crawl outside the tent. Zithrusa watched carefully, but offered no help. He was careful and able to return to the sleeping mat on his own power. He pushed himself and soon was able to stand on shaky legs and totter about. Zithrusa provided a staff for him to lean on and some robes to wear. He thanked her as best he knew how and was rewarded by her smile. 1 or 2 things bothered John. There were no jet contrails in the sky, and there were no modern textiles or materials or objects whatsoever amongst Zithrusa's belongings. Unless she was a character reenactor of the fanatic stripe in the Iraqi no-fly zone, he didn't understand how this could be. Even the most remote tribe in the Amazon had a t-shirt or 2. Most had Walkman disc players as well. There was not so much as a plastic cup to be seen. Slowly, but in reality very quickly, John learned how to speak her language and learned her view of her world. She had no knowledge of writing and made gestures to ward off evil when he tried to show her, gesturing urgently that he erase what he had written, not daring to touch it herself. John was starting to get an inkling by now. It was time to get a move on, to rejoin the people. The caravans were through for the year. There was no longer any fodder for their pack beasts. John walked next to the laden donkey, supporting himself with the staff and a hand on its warm, furry side, while Zithrusa ranged widely, bunching the goats and keeping them moving in the general direction they meant to travel. John was startled at one point when Zithrusa used her sling to good effect, driving off a pair of opportunistic wolves, convincing them to try their luck elsewhere. She also showed him the pug marks of a medium-large cat, smaller than a tiger or lion, but still large for a cat. John guessed it would be the size of a large cougar. John tried to help as much as he could setting up camp and unloading the donkey, but he still felt so helpless and weak. He was able to have simple conversations now, and understood most of what Zithrusa told him. They were 3 days from the meeting place, and then if there was no one there, another 2 to 4 weeks from her people's camp. There was likely no one there, because Zithrusa was over a week late. She didn't seem to be in any hurry either, almost as if she was worried about what kind of reception they would receive. John concentrated on getting his strength back, time enough to worry about the future, tomorrow. As they walked in the dust of the goats, Zithrusa had John practice with her bow, designating one arrow as a practice arrow, removing its head and binding it with sinew to prevent it from splitting. John shot that arrow again and again, getting better and better at hitting his mark and strengthening his arms. After they arrived at the now abandoned meeting spot, they learned that the family was heading for an off-season camp about 4 weeks away. They had left 2 days before, so they could catch up if they hurried. Zithrusa showed no inclination to catch up, and they maintained a pace to follow behind, arriving at each overnight spot exactly 2 days behind the main group. Zithrusa spent this time training John to respond to her cues, and with practice, it was unnoticeable that she was guiding him like he was her flesh puppet. She taught him how to interact with various people, the differences in greeting the headmen and the males of lesser status than John. She decided to just let his lack of sept and guild tattoos speak for themselves. A leader of men wouldn't belong to such organisations but would rather command them. Most princes did not have tattoos, which made it difficult to impersonate such lofty personages for those of more humble origin. She taught him how to behave as a member of the tribe, that the left-hand side of the tent as you entered was for the women and girls only, while respected elders ruled over the back. To always go to the right side when bidden enter the tent, after clapping thrice and waiting for the response. He should bow his head until his eyes had adjusted to the gloom of the windowless tent, and only then meet the eyes of the head male for just the correct interval, and then never look directly at him aside from glances. He should lean his bow against the wall near the door, but his knife could remain in his belt unless needed for eating. He was taught correct table manners, much different than those he was used to. He was to eat all of the first serving, but hardly any of the second serving, as that was actually one of the women's meals offered to make certain he was satiated. She would only eat what he left her, usually the cook or an older auntie or widow. He should eat some of the choicer bits to show that he appreciated the food. It was all very complex, but John studied hard and learned how to behave himself. They still shared the same bed mat, and Zithrusa was slightly disappointed that John didn't try anything sexual with her, although she would have thought less of him if he had, and would have forcibly prevented him from succeeding. She knew, however, from certain unmistakable evidence that he did find her attractive, and so was comforted. At the midday break, to allow the goats to forage and to keep from overtaking the larger group, Zithrusa taught John the traditional games the men played to rank their status: wrestling, a form of tug-of-war combined with sumo; stick and staff fighting with padded ends; caber toss, a distance throw of a head-sized wooden weight tied to a 2-foot rope; knife throwing at a human-sized bundle of straw; sling, bolo, and other tests of skill. Zithrusa was surprised to find that John was capable in most all of these activities, especially because she could see that he had never been exposed to most of them before. He was already skilled with throwing a knife, and he had a special technique for throwing the caber. A strange up and down pulse as he spun around, giving his distance and accuracy to the throw line results that would win against any of her family. One skill he lacked was the sling, since most skilled slingers had been at it since childhood. He shrugged it off as probably not that important, as long as he had other weapons. John was relieved to finally be reacquiring his former strength. He studied his deportment classes intently and relished the games that Zithrusa taught him. He liked the wrestling, because it was much a mental game, of trying to fake out or psyche out your opponent. Causing them to fall outside the circle was only in part due to power, and a weaker but more clever player could often win by trickery. He had great core strength from slinging firewood onto and off of his pickup truck, and he had seen Olympic hammer toss on TV, so he knew about their up and down motion as they spun to get loft momentum. Zithrusa seemed pleased with the result of his unorthodox technique, and he was happy that he felt strong again. So the next few weeks passed, and by now John was speaking almost like a local and well versed in etiquette. It was lucky that this group didn't have many horses, only a handful which were reserved for the headmen and first sons, so he wouldn't have to demonstrate any of his non-existent riding skills. He was very tuned into the subtle guidance Zithrusa provided him, and could note her signals from her posture as she stood to the side, without really looking at her. This could be very helpful. Also helpful was John's quiet, self-effacing personality. He wasn't likely to be ego-driven to respond too strongly to any pushing or posturing. He would let Zithrusa be his guide as to which and how much to respond to for best political effect. At length they had almost arrived at the camp, and Zithrusa deemed it best if they arrived at almost the same time as the main group, so they sped up and timed it so the others had just unloaded the burdens from the animals and were sitting down to rest and survey the location, planning where their tents would go and where the sporting ground would lie. The camp's location was not much different than any other in this wild and empty land, but there was a small river at the bottom of a wide, shallow valley, and the camp on the wide, low bluff offered a long view at the surroundings, without being exposed to the wind. It would be difficult to sneak up upon this camp. A few noticed their approach, and slowly they all became aware and sat there as Zithrusa and John and the goats and donkey came into camp. John carried only the staff and knife at his belt, while Zithrusa carried the bow. Not obviously, but as if by chance, several of the men were not far from their strung bows and arrow-filled quivers. At the correct distance, too far to attack yet close enough to be heard, John shouted the appropriate greetings. "Who comes into our camp with our daughter and our goats?" shouted the headman. "I am John, a lost wanderer until I was salvaged by your daughter. She has claim to me and my gratitude," answered John. He knew that Zithrusa wasn't in fact the headman's daughter. It was more a claim of ownership and kinship. Zithrusa's real father had been a guard in a passing caravel, and her mother an unmarried auntie. As such, she was counted as more of the headman's daughter than any other young woman in camp who actually had a father, although the headman would have called them our daughter as well. The older women could see that John was dressed in robes that they had woven, and that his staff was Zithrusa's. They suspected that his knife was also hers, and they wondered why she had brought a man of so little worth into their camp, dressed in their best. But since it was not the place of women to speak while men were conversing, they watched sharp-eyed, and kept their questions to ask of Zithrusa later. All the men noticed was that John had a familiar, comfortable look to him, as if he was already one of them. He didn't look foreign, in spite of the fact that they had never laid eyes on him before. The men also noted that every goat was accounted for, which spoke well of the skill of their herder. The headman signalled for John to approach, and Zithrusa went over to mingle with the women, while remaining within view of John, and paying attention to the men's conversation. "He is a fool I found in the desert, clad strangely and richly but poor in all other goods. He had not even a water skin or knife," she whispered to them. "But he is quick and strong and may be a lost prince. Note he has no tattoos, although his hands are calloused, and he has strange scars of odd toil. I think he is a hard worker who is not in his normal place. Hush. I want to hear what they are saying." "What payment do you make for the chastity of our daughter?" challenged the headman. At a signal from Zithrusa, John let his hackles rise a bit. "I return her as she found me, as your woman can tell you. As to what condition that is, perhaps you would know better than I," John replied, mildly zinging the headman, who found it amusing and began to laugh. John joined him in laughter, and the moment was disarmed. The headman called for a drink, and as no fires had been laid, in fact no tents erected, a fact which Zithrusa had counted on to produce the most favourable climate. Home ground for the headman, yet without the pomp and finery of an erected tent to swell his ego. And so a jade-carved cup was dug out of a pack, and filled with sour alcoholic goat's milk. The headman gulped half of it, and John gulped down the other half, careful not to show any reaction on his impassive face. It was rank and vile, but now that they had shared a drink, John was afforded guest rights, and couldn't be murdered within camp, or within a day of camp. He had gained minimal status within the family, and was protected by rules. He was also under certain obligations as well, and he must not strike anyone in the face, or sleep with any woman without permission. "What do you seek in our camp?" asked the headman. "I want to be as a son to you for a year, and repay my debt to your daughter Zithrusa, and gain her as my wife," answered John. "After a year as your son, you can decide if you want me to remain a part of your camp, or if I would better take my bride away to seek a different life." There was great advantage to the headman with this uncommon yet accepted practice. He would gain John's labour for a year, and in return would not have to pay dowry. That is, if Zithrusa wasn't a new bride at the end of the year. "Very well, it shall be so," Zithrusa shall be your temporary wife, until you have been my hard-working son for a year, and then she will be your very own wife, to take with you if you decide to leave us. It is better that you have even a temporary wife while you stay among us, to make sure you are not the cause of trouble and strife. I see some of my wives are looking at you with a hungry eye," the headman joked, while looking sternly at John through his chuckles in a meaningful way which was not lost on John. The headman clapped his hands twice and declared, "Break is over, let's build a camp." It was amazing to John at how quickly the camp was erected, and rugs laid down inside the tents, and barriers put up between the right and left sides of most of the tents. There was one young unmarried men's tent, for those in that small window of age between manhood and married man. Very small window since there were so few available men. John saw some young men who were only 13 who were already married, and performing the duties of a man. He helped put up Zithrusa's tent where directed, and she was glad to be able to continue sleeping with John, and in fact to begin acting towards him more as a wife. Since John had no animals, he was fed as a son of the headman, and in the morning he went where he was told, and did what was needed. He learned how to stake out the animals, and tend to the horses. He was assigned to night watch, and was able to remain alert for his entire shift, catching the half-humorous yet deadly serious attempts by the young boys to sneak past his post. Had he been caught sleeping, he would have been shamed and his status would have fallen greatly. He was thankful for long practice at staying awake for days on end when needed. After he was relieved from duty, he returned to share his bed with Zithrusa, and she made it clear that he was expected to bang her drum loudly and still get up early and do a full day's work. John had no problem with his duties, and slowly worked Zithrusa up to a fevered pitch, playing her body like an instrument. After sleeping by her side for so many weeks, he was more than ready, and in his imagination he had already done the deed with her many times. The reality was better than his imagination. She was so responsive and vocal, it was very exciting and stimulating. Some things she wasn't so sure about, but he persuaded her to his perversions, and she was glad he did. When his tongue finally laved her clit, she shrieked so ear-splittingly loud that John was glad her thighs were covering his ears. There were muted chuckles from the surrounding tents, and then strange noises started to emanate from those tents as well. The next morning, John rose before anyone else, and was sitting in front of his tent greeting the morning when the other men crawled wearily from their tents. John greeted them with a cheerful smile, and laughed at their jokes about panthers sneaking into camp. "If any panthers came into camp, it wasn't while I was on watch," he gibed. "Perhaps we should check your backs and see if the panther attacked any of you." He grinned at them. Several of the men blushed and turned their heads away, including the headman. John relaxed and let the strange ghostly music, with its breathy quality, float him in a trance. It spoke of rare rains, sudden flowering of wasteland, rainbows and dew. It was incredible that such a small instrument, like a stick with 2 strings on it jammed into a tiny round drum, could produce such ethereal and dulcet waftings. Zithrusa gently drew the horsetail bow back and forth slowly as she lightly touched the strings, just firmly enough to shorten their chords. There was only traditional style, and no composition was ever the same as any other. The music was fleeting and transient, just like the beauty of nature. The children sat in a semicircle in front of John, listening excitedly, and yet frozen in place to his story of oceans of water, freezing temperatures, snow and waves, whales and fish and boats and coastal towns. It was also exotic and amazing. The adults also listened to his stories, just as entranced and quiet as the children, yet managing to continue their small busy tasks of making rope by hand, weaving, matting felt, and cobbling leather boots. For much of the year everyone went barefoot, but at certain times, or for trekking, boots were worn. Soon it would be time to move again. There was a multi-clan gathering and everyone was making their best clothing and finery, also crafts to trade. It was half carnival and half family reunion, deaths to be learned of and mourned, marriages to be celebrated, births announced, and engagements proposed. Also, it was half Olympics and half county fair, with cooking and weaving contests, and athletic feats and challenges. It was a time for everyone to show off and gain recognition if they could. Zithrusa told John that he would be participating in all the athletic challenges except for sling, and that there would be large bets on him to win knife throwing and carver tossing. He should try to win any other events he could, but just for the prestige. The breakdown of the camp was just as efficient as the setup had been, and John watched closely so he would be of more help next time. His efforts were not very effective, but he did what he could. These people had been doing this many times a year for their entire lives. Soon all the animals were loaded up, and everyone had their boots on, and they set off for the gathering grounds. It was the rainy season, so there was plenty of forage for the animals, a crucial ingredient when planning a gathering. After walking for over a week, John spotted dust in the air in 2 different places. "Yes," said the headman. "We are getting close, and it looks like we are early enough to get a prime camp." The camping was first come, first served, but what was the best spot 2 weeks earlier was not so great after 2 weeks of camping, so it didn't do to get here too early either. They could hear the sound of a crowd in the distance, shouts, laughter, dogs barking. It was all very strange after the silences of the wilds. The silence had been ignored like ringing in the ears, and now that there was noise to hear, it left an after-impression of deafness. John felt his excitement rising and sensed it mirrored in the family about him, building higher the nearer they got, bubbling up in a frisson that left them reeling and panting. Seeing so many people in one place after the empty lands and only the family was a shock to John, and he wondered at what becomes customary. Any good-sized fishing town was easily 10 times the population of the gathering, yet the masses of happy people oppressed him. Most of them knew each other, having been to a gathering a year for their lives. Some clans were not arrived yet, so the crowds would only swell greater. John asked his way to the games marshal, and was given tokens to enter in the games he chose, which was everything except for the slinging. John asked to go last in the carver toss, and was allowed, when he explained he had a secret method he didn't want others to copy this year. John wandered about the trading grounds looking at the goods. He had nothing to barter with, he thought sadly, so he just window shopped. Although there was no window to look through, everything was displayed on blankets on the ground. He lusted after a pair of matched and beautifully balanced throwing knives, a hefty 9 inches long overall with 5-inch blades and a weighted pommel. It was when he saw the hornbow that he thought of his gloves. He went to find Zithrusa and asked her about trading the gloves for the knives and bow. She coached him for about 15 minutes and then went with him to signal him through the barter. With her help, John got the 2 knives, sheaths and a leather belt for 1 glove, and the hornbow, a quiver of 40 arrows, extra strings, and a plain-looking staff for the other glove. When they left, the 2 proud owners of the gloves were each trying to bargain the other glove away from each other. While they had gotten a good bargain, it reminded John that something was worth what a person valued it to be. For him, he had gotten value. John had a day to become familiar with his new knives. He set up the man-shaped straw target and was astonished at what a good pair of knives could do. He was even better than he had realised, and the knives seemed to go where he willed them. John had started throwing knives and axes as a teenager and had relaxed after a hard day's wood-splitting by throwing at a target pinned to a stump. He was good enough with a double-bladed axe to enter in logging contests if he wanted to, but it had always seemed too much bother to him. It wasn't his personality to seek attention, but in this culture, one needed recognition and status to further oneself. In the course of testing himself and his knives, John threw from every distance, not just the standard gaming distance. He tried some throws as he moved, and as he rolled, and he was still hitting good marks. He challenged himself to get both knives in the target as quickly as possible, and had the second knife tumbling down range before the first one hit, and scored with both. All of his throws sank hilt deep in the tightly bundled straw. The headman came and watched for a while, his eyes glinting with anticipation and pleasure. He told John, "Hit both of the straw man's eyes for me, then quit practicing, my obedient son." John stood with his back to the target, spun around and threw both blades one after another, and both stuck into the middle of the straw head, a palm width apart. He retrieved his knives, saluted his father, and retired to his tent to play with his bow. Zithrusa showed John how to read the time and day marks on his entry tokens, and he wandered down to the caber pitch. He looked at the distance markings, and some were just at the furthest he had himself made. He was nervous, but Zithrusa signalled him to just go for a perfect toss, so he put the competition from his mind and settled into his zone, focusing on having everything go exactly right. He was the last contestant, and he hadn't watched any of the others toss, so he was playing his own game against himself, concentrating on his form and accuracy. Of course, he also gave it every ounce of force he could swing, in that curious bouncing motion that seemed to counter centrifugal force and gravity. At first he thought he had lost. His distance number was just a little less than the next furthest distance, but everyone was cheering and slapping him on the back. He hadn't understood that the distance off of the line, an actual rope laid straight down the pitch, was subtracted from the distance. His distance was right on the line, so there was no adjustment, and his score beat the contender's adjusted score. The family won large bets on his win, gaining several horses and a silver tea set. More importantly, their status rose, which they sorely needed, being so short on sons. It didn't matter how many weaving and cooking wins they had if they didn't also have some sporting wins. John managed to avoid sharing more than 3 cups of fermented milk without mortally offending anyone, and snuck off to practice with his new bow. He didn't expect to win anything with it, having only practiced archery for a few months, but it was his newest toy. The clans had been using bows since they could pull the string. Even a child's bow could kill a man, and most children weren't strong enough to use the children's bow until they were almost old enough to be considered an adult. The youngest child John had seen using a child's bow was 9, and she had brought back a wolf pelt from tending the herd. Zithrusa thought she reminded her of herself. She remembered drawing the string of her own child's bow for months until she could hold it steady enough to hit a target. She was so proud of herself, and a few months after she demonstrated her new skill, she was sent off with a donkey and a flock of goats for several months alone. John woke up excited. This was the day for knife throwing. It was a playoff event, 2 throwers pairing off, and the winner advancing. John expected to have to throw his knives many times before the day was through. He intended to throw just well enough to advance, and to save himself for later in the game. He asked his father about that, and the headman thought it was an excellent idea. He wandered off talking to himself and counting on his fingers. John presented his token to the games marshal, and was given a coloured rock on a rope to wear. He was 10th up, paired with a scrawny young man who had a tuft of hair on his chin he seemed proud of. The first 10 contestants were not showing much, but then maybe they had to save it for later strategy also. The young man threw, and John betted him. John advanced. So the morning went, and on into the afternoon. John just politely allowed the other of the pair to go first, and then he trumped their throw. He had to improve his own throw as the day grew shorter, until there were only 8 throwers left. John caught Zithrusa's signal to not hold back anymore, so John threw his best. His last 2 challengers made excellent throws, so John threw from double the distance to beat them. They complained, so John's father told him to do what he had done last night before quitting practice. John stood with his back to the target, then he suddenly spun and the knives flashed through the air, slamming into the face of the straw man hilt deep, right where his eyes would be. The crowd of onlookers shouted in approval, and the complaining challengers were invited to do better. They had the sense to know they were bettered, and the win went to John. The family gained much honour and acclaim, and also lots of material gains as well. If John had lost, it would have been a very rough time for the family, but having seen John at practice, the headman had felt justified in risking much as little risk as it seemed to him. After that, the rest of the games were pretty anticlimactic. John gave a decent showing in his other entries, but it didn't really matter. His fame had already been won. Still, it was a very good year for the family. They came away much increased. After a few more days, the gathering dispersed, scattering to find food for all their hungry animals. There were newlyweds saying goodbye to their families, fast friendships parting for another year, various relatives saying so long, discussions of routes, forage, caravans and traders, bandits and wolves, and friendships pledged in fermented milk, or in exchanged gifts. Soon there was nothing left but a scrap of cloth blowing in the dusty air, and some much-abused forage left behind. Now that John had brought so much status to the family, he was their golden boy. Before, the only ones who would talk with him were Zithrusa and Headman, and he couldn't even learn any of their names, including Headman, which is why he called him that. Zithrusa wouldn't tell him any of the family's names either. It was up to each individual to form their own relationships. Now that he was everybody's darling, he was having the family introduce themselves faster than he could remember their names. Still, it was nice to be accepted, and everyone was being much friendlier now. John made a kite from thin cotton which he had rubbed lamb fat into. It caught the wind pretty well, but there wasn't much twine available for string. The children loved the kite, and John set them to making string, and soon enough with everyone rolling plant stalks in their hands till they were raw, and twining the fibres till their fingers were sore, he had enough string to fly the kite 50 feet in the air. That was plenty on the windy steppes they were traversing now. He taught them how to fly it, and let them play. "If you had kites made for the next gathering, there would be plenty of good barter," said Gromvidich, a gap-toothed, rheumy-eyed elder. "You would just have to let the children play with one around the gathering, and everyone would want one. Of course, once they bought one, they would figure out how to make their own. The children should make the twine for flying the kites. That is needed, no mater who makes the kite. The children would have good barter," offered John. The children were already making their own tiny kites, because they didn't want to wait too long for their turn to fly John's bigger kite. John borrowed some pigment from one of the aunties, and painted a fierce, scowling dragon's face on the kite, which made the children giggle and scream in mock fear when he swooped it down at them as if it was attacking. It was great fun. Suddenly 7 men appeared on the crest of a ridge, holding 2 of the older children by the necks, daggers bared. They shouted down, "Bring us your horses to buy the lives of these children." The children were junior scouts who were supposed to be alert and watchful, and assist the regular scouts in keeping an eye out for bandits and thieves, leopards and wolves. John asked Butalus, the headman, if he could take the horses up and try to free the children. The headman agreed, and John made a show of taking off his bow and removing his quiver, and gathering the 8 horses, after their riders dismounted, and leading them up the hill. When he was within range, he stopped, and demanded that they release the children. The men laughed and told him nice try. They demanded that he drop the reins and back up, which fit into his plans quite well. John fell back, and one of the men stepped forward to grab the horses. John gave a get-ready signal to the 2 children, and when the man approaching blocked the other men from attacking him, John threw his daggers at the heads of the men holding families' children, piercing each one's brain through the eye socket. As the men fell, John slapped the horses across their rumps and started them forward with a shrill cry. The horses bolted toward the men, further distracting them and knocking the one who had come for them on his rear. John was running forward by now, kicking the man sitting on the ground in the chin as he came by and up close among the remaining 4, who had just been run over by a herd of horses. Well, they had been outnumbered 2 to 1 anyway. The 2 children, being nomadic children and as such much more capable than the modern kind, had each taken up the knife John had left for them in the faces of their former captive, and stood back-to-back knives in hand to prevent themselves being retaken. Although John was excellent with his new throwing knives, he was also very good with any knife or axe or hatchet, so it should be no surprise that when he whipped out his eating knife, which had formerly belonged to Zithrusa, that he was accurate and deadly with it as he closed in. And then there were 3. While the 3 focused on John, the 2 children who were almost of an age to be considered as adults, wanting to regain their status, which was lowered by allowing themselves to be taken by an enemy, had slipped behind the remaining 3 and sunk John's throwing knives, which also worked quite well as handheld weapons, deep into the kidneys of 2 of their former captors. As anyone who has ever been knifed in the kidney might tell you, it is an experience which gives one pause. They each stood up on tippy-toe, and uttered a breathless squawk as their eyes unfocused with surprise and shock. John didn't play fair with the last one, the one who had shouted their ill-conceived demands to the family while threatening the family's children. He merely kicked him in the eggs hard enough to break them. John was already thinking in his new language. Eggs is what they called them. Butylus had arrived by then, and he waved the rescued children to go fetch the horses, which they did after cleaning all 3 of John's knives and returning them to him reverently. John looked in disgust at his eating knife. It had just stirred human brains through eyeball. He hoped there wasn't any kuru or laughing sickness in this part of the world. He hadn't yet attended any funerals to know if they practiced any unsavoury rites, but he didn't think they would. It was a long way from wherever he was to New Guinea. Butylus began questioning the injured man. Well, the injured man who was not dying. Dying yet, that is. When they checked the one knocked on his backside and then kicked by John, they found him dead, with a broken neck. The children, who probably wouldn't be considered children for too much longer, had twisted and swiveled the knives as they removed them from their former captors' kidneys, who were not going to survive that experience. By rather brutal methods which would be better glossed over, Butylus gained the information that there were 3 guards and some women and children at their camp about 8 miles away. John had an idea which he shared with Butylus, who agreed and roared with laughter. The camp looked up with alarm at their bloody-handed headman as he howled like a madman. It was decided to just move camp as being easier than disposing of the 7 corpses. The entire camp wanted to witness John's practical joke on the remaining bandits and kidnappers, so Butylus chose 2 grannies and 2 aunties to remain behind, and had the unmarried men draw lots, the 2 losers having to also remain at their new camp, only 2 miles away from where the enemy camp was. Cautioned to wait until well after dark before lighting the fires, the rest of the family snuck over to find ringside seats surrounding the enemy camp. When the sun had set and twilight was setting in, John flew the kite down over the tiny encampment, and when one of the children looked up at it, he swooped it suddenly down from the darkening sky into the light of the fire, where the strange flying shape suddenly revealed that it had an unfriendly scowl, large teeth, and staring eyes. Naturally, she screamed in terror. John swooped the kite back up into the darkness and had it dodge the arrows that the men fired at it. None of the women or children were armed, a fact that John made a note of. John again swooped the kite down, just far enough that the eyes were visible in the firelight, and more arrows were released, as well as some moans of terror. The family was hard-pressed to stifle their laughter. Their John was so amusing. This was entertainment the likes of which they had never experienced before. This left the old men with their funny faces and silly stories in the dust, and easily topped the young men's bragging contests. There had never been such a practical joke. Luckily, the headman frowned on practical jokes. It was all fun and games until someone lost an eye. That wasn't a problem for enemies, though, and John swooped the kite down so that the barbs he had tied to the tail raked the face of one of the men, who screamed like a girl and dropped his bow and ran into the night. He was intercepted, of course, but just barely, as the family was giggling so much they almost let him escape, instead of hurting him, so that his scream of agony drove icy fear deep into the hearts of the remaining 2 guards. One of them fell to his face and cowered, his weaponless hands over his head as he cried like a baby. It is unknown if this is the moment that John knew for certain that he wasn't in Kansas anymore, but the sight of a grown man grovelling in terror because of a painted kite being flown at night certainly added to his growing conviction that although the stars and moon were the same, this wasn't his own world. The last man fled, and was dragged into the camp again, as all the family walked into the firelight, John among them carrying his kite. The women of the camp looked in amazement, and then grabbed flaming sticks from the fire and attacked the 2 frightened guards. Their revenge was too terrible to recount, but it was entertaining for the family, who realised these women and children were the bandits' former prisoners. When the vengeance was over, Butylus signalled the grannies to talk with the women, and after some discussion, they all wanted to join the family and not try to find the families they had been taken from. After all, who had rescued them, their old family or their new one? With the loot from the bandits' camp, the family would be wealthy enough to absorb all the new members, women though they were. there was enough loot to provide dowry for all the as-yet unmarried women. Butalis didn't exactly give Zithrusa a dowry, but he did give her what she was lacking to make a household, a tea service and chafing dish, an oil lamp, the rights to the wool of 3 sheep, and the milk from 3 goats in perpetuity, or as long as she and John remained with the family. These simple things completed their household and permitted them to have all the modern conveniences of home. With the wool, Zithrusa could make clothing for them, and with the milk she could make cheese. She could trade the excess weaving and cheeses for grain to make the flat trail bread. John could hunt for small game, or better yet, she could use her sling to acquire the occasional meat for the pot. He also gave her the tent that she and John were using already. The only thing a dowry would have given them that they didn't have already was some actual animals, some heirloom jade, a brass mirror and the like. Since John had a feeling that they would be leaving when the year was up, it was actually better not to have the animals, and to John's mind, heirlooms were a responsibility to be passed down the generations, not a resource anyway. Every night John lavished attention on Zithrusa and banged her drum soundly. She in return learned to worship his staff until his eggs leaked their whites. During the day, John worked hard since that is the only way he had ever worked. He learned the men's occupations around the fire, making rope and spinning yarn, sewing leather for boots, belts and sheaths, carving objects and small carpentry like stools for the respected elders and dowry chests for the maidens. He was very good at the woodwork and carving, which was good because wood was scarce and not to be wasted. He carved a fine wooden comb for Zithrusa and made her a fine chest to store their kitchen in. The elders greatly admired his carvings of strange mythical beasts they had never even heard of, like whales and seals and walrus and bears. Actually, one of the elders had heard of a bear once. John even made a miniature totem pole, which was hidden away by the wise man, who was too wise to be known as a shaman, as being too special for everyday looking. His carvings brought good barter when the caravans passed by, and many caravans sought them out to see what they had for trade, made by John's hand. Of course, John didn't profit much by this, except as Butalis graced him, he was just a hard-working son of the family, at least for the next 6 months. He did own one great treasure, which was to finance his quest for his fortune, and that was his bright orange survival suit. John figured that it would be worth much more to the right buyer, and so he would take it to civilization, which by all accounts was in the east, to find the one who would value it the most. John figured if he could sell it to a seagoing king by explaining its virtues of life protection in cold waters, never mind the gloves, what you see is what you get, then he could get a price above rubies and diamonds for it. Then with careful investment he could, well, he couldn't imagine not working, but perhaps he could be a trader and see the world. What was known of it, that is. That brought to his mind what he knew about the world that he didn't think many others did, things he had learned in school. He could figure out how to prove such things to civilized scholars, and perhaps gain by it, or get financing for exploration and discovery. He could be as famous as Columbus, and let Sinai colonialize the Western Hemisphere. But he wasn't into putting himself forward, only as much as he needed to please Zithrusa. Even so, it was something to keep in mind if he wanted to explore further than this part of the world. He chuckled to himself. He had never been to Hawaii. John spent a lot of his time while watching over a herd practicing with his bow. He had 3 target arrows, which he just about wore out firing over and over. His concentration helped him gain a proficiency that was usually only given by a lifetime of practice. He had that Zen focus of being the arrow going on. He kept his newfound prowess to himself, except for showing Zithrusa, so she could consider it in any calculations. He also trained hard with the family men in staff and single stick. Swords were known, but impractical for the nomadic lifestyle, and were usually only carried by the eastern princes, a sort of a swagger stick, one which could behead someone with. The nomads weren't worried about that too much after all. A bow had a much greater reach than a sword. A sword was a most impractical weapon against a wolf. A sling would be a much better choice. Once the wolf was dead, would a sword be much use to skin it with? It was a funny joke and everyone laughed. John made himself a single stick that was longer than usual, and trained by himself, as well as he was able, knowing at some point he would be among men who wore swords and who wouldn't treat him as an equal unless he also wore one. If he was going to wear a sword, he should be able to use it well enough to have a chance at surviving the experience, if he had to use it, he thought. Zithrusa continued to use John as face for her schemes and agenda, and like any good husband, he willingly went along with her, wholeheartedly supporting her machinations. A few times he got done what she wanted, but in a way that she had to admit to herself was a better way than what she had supported. John befriended who she indicated, joined this or that hunting or scouting group, gave meat or firewood to such and such elder. It was the personal politics of the small group, kind of like Survivor, except the failures weren't voted off, they just lost status, face and personal clout. John was very quickly a rising star, and Zithrusa had him make propitiating gestures to those who might feel threatened by his success, to assuage them and indicate that John wasn't seeking to surpass them on the social ladder. Zithrusa had spoken to John about a second wife, which would raise both of their status, making John a two-wife man, and making Zithrusa a head wife. But John pointed out that it was better to finish their probation and make Zithrusa a wife first instead of temporary wife. Zithrusa was in a hurry to gain status, mainly by increasing John's status, but she could see the wisdom of his words. Zithrusa was very happy with John. He used her knowledge of social nuance, but he didn't let her be fully in charge, and sometimes pulled her in a bit when she got too far out of line. He sometimes put his foot down, and then as husband had the final say. They made a very good team. John was careful not to usurp various top personages, although he could have surpassed various of them. He was now among the best hunters. His spirits, or subconscious, led him right to the game. He knew more of first aid than the healer, and had set some broken bones in the field before splinting them, and it was considered lucky that they healed straight. Often a broken bone just grew back as best it could, leaving a painful, crooked reminder of the injury. It helped that John let his actions speak for themselves and didn't engage in the pastime of braggadocio. Bragging was a sport of sorts among the family, and the young men vied to outdo each other with tales of their prowess and daring. Like cockerels flying at one another with displays of finery, they puffed and preened and strutted. The family preferred John's form of entertainment much better. John discovered within himself a talent for storytelling. He retold mangled versions of Homer's Iliad. He told tales of Sinbad, Aladdin, Arthur, El Cid, and Sherlock. He told stories of what he could recall of Bilbo and Frodo. He told about Tom and Huck, Robinson Crusoe, and Long John Silver. Zithrusa especially enjoyed hearing the stories told by Scheherazade, while the children delighted to learn of the adventures of Tarzan and Mowgli. The elders and grannies liked the stories about the children who slipped back to times and places so different than they had known, and grew up to be kings and queens in a land of talking animals. John's stories woke up the family, stirred their imaginations, sparked ideas that would plant seeds and begin to grow. The idea that everyone was important, even if they crouched under skin and felt tense, under a vast and indifferent sky. The children were especially fertile of mind, and small innovations were seen sprouting after centuries of fallow imagination yielding only the traditional. It must be admitted that John sometimes planted these innovations himself, using the children as face to avoid notice or notoriety to himself. Zithrusa couldn't gain recognition for things in the men's domain that she might happen to be good at. Slinging skill was only recognized as being a good cook who always had a rich stew. That 9-year-old girl who proudly brought in the wolfskin didn't earn any status for her skill with bow, but for protecting her charges. The men and women gained only reflected glory for acclaim in outgender skill sets. John's status rose for having a good cook for a wife, and Zithrusa gained status for having a skilled hunter for a husband. As Zithrusa listened to John tell his delightful stories in the dim light from the flickering oil lantern, as the family sat about in the big communal tent after nightfall, her hands and fingers were busy weaving the fine wool thread she had spun into very rich, fine, valuable cloth, to make suitable clothing for John to wear when facing to princes and kings. She had to spin the wool herself, since John was useless at it. Zithrusa knew that they would be leaving when the year was up, and although it was sad to have to leave the family, it was the way of women in this part of the world, and in many other parts as well. The woman left her family and went with the husband, who usually returned to his own family. But in any case, she went with him. Even though it was mostly with her help, Zithrusa could tell that John was going places. She anticipated with excitement all the wonderful places and peoples she had heard about, while listening on the outskirts as the men talked with the traders. And John was going to go there and see them and be successful, and she was going to go along as his helper and support. It was even better than her childish fantasy of being third wife to some soft prince and being stuck in some seraglio and seeing only perfumed cushions and hearing only petty bitching and backstabbing. She could sense the wanderlust and adventurer in John. He was driven to achieve as well. The year passed quickly for the couple, proud of each other and grateful for their partnership. One day, about a month before John's fostering to the family was to be completed, John sought out Butalus and let him know that he intended to seek his fortune or fate when he was free to do so. "I have been waiting for you to come to me about this, John," counselled Butalus, placing a fatherly hand on John's shoulder. "I have known from the start that our little family was too small to hold your world. Although we will miss you and the prestige you have brought us, we have no hold on you, and all your debts are repaid. Pack your belongings and go now to the caravan route. There is yet one caravan passing by before they no longer travel until next season. Go with the good fates, and if you ever pass this way again, seek us out and be welcomed back into your family," concluded Butalus, pretending that he was wiping dust from his eye. John clasped forearms with the wise old headman, made his farewells to the rest of the family, and packed up his worldly belongings. The farewell gifts included the old donkey, who was unlikely to make the entire journey, fine trading goods from all the family, who had been much enriched by John's sojourn amongst them, and 1,000 feet of twine from the children. "This is too much," protested John. The children assured him that it was only half of their stock, and with the bartering they would get at the gathering with kites, they would all be very wealthy children indeed. Openly crying, yet unable to stay any longer, for his heart was filled with wonder and yearning to see what was down the trail, John shouldered his bow and quiver, hitched his belt into place, grabbed his staff and set out, followed by Zithrusa, who had made her own farewells and received gifts of her own from her family who she was departing, perhaps never to see again. Like John, her heart was also filled with anticipation, as well as sorrow for leaving her family behind. But she had always known this moment would come, and in fact hoped for, and looked forward to, and had even dreaded not happening, leaving her a maiden auntie like her mother. There was only one caravan route through this part of the area, so Zithrusa and John were able to find out that the last caravan hadn't passed by yet. They set up their home to the side of the trail and waited, using the time in various ways. John hunted alongside the trail, in the direction the traders would be coming from, so he wouldn't miss them, and Zithrusa completed making some very fine clothing for John, and cooking up some long-lasting trail bread. They had plenty of cheese put by for the journey already. John took a pair of antelope, or they looked like antelope to him, and it didn't make any difference what they really were. He, with Zithrusa's help, prepared them in thin slices and dried them in the smoke of the fire and in the rays of the sun. Depending on what kind of deal he could make with the caravan master, he wanted to be prepared to feed themselves for a while. Finally, after waiting beside the trail for a week, John spotted the caravan in the distance and hurried back to the tent. The caravan arrived in the late afternoon, and the caravan master, recognizing that a single tent would only be camping near the trail for one reason, to conduct some business with a caravan, called for the train to halt for the night. John waited until they were situated before drawing nigh to the caravan master. At the proper distance, John called out his greeting, both his hands visible. The caravan master called for 2 stools and some date wine, and bid John to join him. They sat about 8 feet apart, and a servant or slave poured 2 tiny glasses of the wine for them. It was just enough for the ritual, but not enough to cost much if it turned out that there was no profit to be had from talking with John. "What barter do you have?" asked the caravan master. "I wish to work for you, and to travel with you towards the rising sun, as far as you go," began John, mentally preparing himself for a bargaining session. The caravan master groaned to himself. He didn't need another ignorant tribesman tagging along. He wasn't carrying high-value goods. Well, high enough to warrant caravanning it all the way from Tyre to Sinai. He had bought raw silk skeins and carried them all the way to Tyre to have them dyed with the sea whelks there. It was the only way to get silk of that colour, although blue plant dyes were found just about everywhere. The dark pink or burgundy colour imparted by the rotting seashells was found only in the far west. He was now carrying the silk back, coloured the Tyrian purple, both the darker version which was dyed at night, and thus caught some night in its weave, and the lighter rose or dark pink which was dyed in the daylight. It was the same tank it was dipped into, and the night-dipped thread was more costly for some unknown reason. "I have all the workers I need," grunted the caravan master. "More than I can feed, it seems at times." He continued discouragingly. "Then you need me. I will provide meat for everyone as we travel," said John with confidence. "So you know the route we take?" the caravan master challenged suspiciously. "It matters not. The fates have given me a charmed bow that never misses, and which points out the nearest game," John bragged. He knew it was risky putting the credit on his bow, but he could always say the spell was broken if anyone stole the bow and couldn't get it to work for them, and it was better that the credit didn't go to himself, where there could be a charge of witchery or sorcery. Anyone could possess an enchanted object, and not be suspected of possessing magic of themselves. The caravan master was interested. A man with a bow that never missed was a valuable person to have on a long journey through chancy lands. He signalled for the slave to pour another round of date wine. "It is still 3 hours before dark. Can your magic bow seek game before nightfall?" the caravan master wondered. John signalled Zithrusa, who approached with the bow, treating it in a way appropriate to handling an object of powers. John performed some hocus-pocus and consulted his spirits, and felt that he could sense a large predator following along beside the caravan, more curious than hungry. "My bow tells me that there is game near, that I could hunt before dark, but it would not be meat for eating, and I would need a steady horse to bring its pelt in with. I ween it would overtax our old ass." The caravan master was astonished. Such a fur to overtax the sturdy little donkey would be of value enough to pay their way as passengers, not workers. "Very well, bring me the fur of the game that isn't for meat, and we can talk more." It was a win-win situation for the caravan master, no matter the outcome. So there was no cost to his agreeing to the deal. He signalled for a calm blind mare to be led up, and told John he would see him before dark. John rode the horse in the direction the spirits told him the giant carnivore was. He would need all his skill to kill it with arrows, no matter how accurate he was. He wondered what he would find. When he got close from the downwind side, he left the horse, telling her to be still, and crept off towards the beast to see what he could see. He crept up a short rise on his belly, and almost didn't see it at first. It was only the lashing tail which gave him the creature's location. It looked more like a stuffed toy than what John would consider a tiger, being shorter of body, quite stocky, and having rounded ears like a bear. Its colour was almost yellow rather than orange, and it had a ruff somewhat like a male lion's but much less bushy. It was stalking a young shepherd and his flock of sheep, which were unaware of his presence due to the tiger being downwind from them, as John was downwind from the tiger. It was a large beast, easily outmassing their donkey, which was admittedly rather small. John could tell by the movements of the tail, if it meant anything like what a house cat's tail would mean, that the large male tiger was about to attack. John drew his bow, and when the tiger raised and wriggled his bottom preparatory to charging, John, not knowing if its target was a sheep or the shepherd, fired an arrow into the tiger's rear, using the convenient little round bullseye as his aiming point. The tiger jumped, straight up into the air, letting out a snarl which startled the sheep into flight. followed a second later by the shepherd, who turned to see the rampant tiger doing acrobatics 50 feet behind him. John waited for another target, but the tiger was racing in circles trying to bite its tail until it suddenly fell over dead. John's shot had not been impeded by muscle, fur or skin, and had actually penetrated into the tiger all the way to his heart, the arrow fully inside the magnificent predator. John waited another 5 minutes, but the caravan scouts came up around him, looking in awe at the terrible beast which John had slain with a single arrow. They helped him skin it, knowing how to take the skin whole, the fact that it wasn't pierced like a pincushion enhancing its value greatly. They loaded the skin on the back of the blind mare, who resented its weight more than its smell, and arrived back at the caravan half an hour before dark. One of the scouts took the bloodied arrow to the caravan master and told him that it was the only arrow in the beast, and it had been found 3 feet inside the wound it had caused, buried in the great cat's heart. The skin was spread out, and its great size was remarked on by all, and the fact that the skin was in perfect condition. All agreed that John's magic bow was powerful indeed. Knowing how to bargain, the caravan master told John, "Very well, you have earned an audience with me to further discuss what arrangements we might come to regarding your employment." John took his leave for the night, going to get cleaned up, and to have his dinner with Zithrusa. "So you can hunt, but what I really need are warriors, fighters who can protect the caravan," stated the caravan master disingenuously, knowing that a marksman like John was much more valuable to the caravan than one of his fence pickets of guards, who didn't need to be that good to get between bandits and the caravan's goods. "I see you do not even wear a sword," continued the caravan master, seeking every advantage he could instinctively. Bargaining and bartering was his life's blood, and the only reason he was a successful trader. "I would fight any man you put before me with a sword in his hand," countered John. "But then you would be short a fighting man. Perhaps you have some less final test you would wish to put me to?" he offered in exchange. The caravan master was pleased. This John seemed very confident. If it wasn't mere bragging, he would be a valuable asset to have with the caravan. Perhaps a test that would entail no loss, and might provide some entertainment as well. Meanwhile, Zithrusa was packing up their camp in preparation to joining the caravan, a mark of confidence which was not lost on the caravan master. The caravan master noticed that John was not a large or powerful-looking man, and thought that if John lost the contest he proposed, that the caravan master would still allow him to join the caravan, but at disadvantageous terms. "I propose that you wrestle with one of my men," suggested the caravan master. He called up a large and powerful-looking man, and looked to John to see any signs of trepidation. John probed, "I am familiar only with the clan's form of wrestling. Are you familiar with the rules?" The large man indicated that he was, and soon the entire caravan gathered about the 12-foot circle as the caravan master bound the 2 men's left hands together. He positioned them in the centre and asked if they were ready. When they both answered in the affirmative, he brought his raised hand down sharply and barked, "Begin!" The large man pulled sharply with his left hand, intending to whiplash John out of the ring. John went with the tug instead of resisting against it, surprising the larger man as John spun, putting his back to the man's chest and his arm over John's shoulder. Usually not a position a wrestler wanted to be in, but before the man could react, John pulled their tied hands down and between his legs, trapping them between his thighs as John bent forward, lifting the other man's feet from the ground, and removing any chance he had of using his greater strength for leverage. Then John simply backed to the edge of the wrestling circle and straightened up, allowing the man's feet to touch the ground. It was all over in 10 seconds. "That was a trick, I was unprepared, that proves nothing," bellowed the sore loser. John sighed, and just nodded his head disgustedly when the caravan master suggested, "Best 2 out of 3? Are you ready?" The caravan master asked his champion pointedly, repeating the question to John. At their positive response, he again whipped his hand down, starting the match again. Do-overs weren't in the clan's rulebook, but you have to give the caravanners a little slack, John thought wryly. As the man pulled their bound hands again toward him, this time using his right hand to deflect and control John to the outside of the ring, John used the proffered arm to launch himself over the larger man's back, after resisting a microsecond just to get the man's muscles tense and resisting. He kicked the back of the man's knees as he came down behind him, causing him to fall on his face, his left arm crossing his own throat in a choke hold, John kneeling on his back. When he reached back with his right hand, John grabbed it in a submission hold, pronating the wrist backward against the arm. The man knew that he was totally at John's mercy, but it took a bit more choking and pain before he responded to John's invitation and moved his leg to the side, putting his own foot out of the ring. The onlookers were stunned, with the exception of Zithrusa, who was ecstatic. Never had they seen two wrestlers of such disparately unmatched size wrestle to such a counterintuitive result so decisively. Zithrusa came over and cut the binding between the contestants' hands, and John asked the caravan master mildly, "So what are you offering for wages?" John settled his wages with Zithrusa's subtle help at half a camel's burden for their own transportation of goods. They had allowed the caravan master to talk them down from a full camel's burden. 12 skeins of silk thread. They had started asking for 15 of the darker purple and let the caravan master talk them into the cheaper rose hue, and food for both John and his wife. In return, John would provide meat as possible for the entire caravan and fight independently as a scout or general, not being under any other's orders when the caravan was attacked. This was actually a good deal for the caravan master, since John hadn't asked for shares. What he didn't know was that John was going to carry high-value stock with his half-camel load. John would have lots of free time between attacks and while not hunting, to make carvings. They didn't take up much room, and were quite valuable if parcelled out sparingly. At the first wooded area they passed through, John, guided by Zithrusa, traded the tired little ass for enough fine-cured wood to fill the rest of their half-a-camel load. Perhaps the man who traded the wood thought they were foolish to let such a nice little ass go for only wood, but value is what people place worth on, and to Zithrusa, she got a treasure of wood. "What? You don't think wood just grows on trees, do you?" she asked John mischievously. John had to agree that the little donkey would be well treated like a valuable resource and would not have to walk halfway around the world. Zithrusa also had lots of spare time, but it was mostly occupied walking along beside the caravan. At night, and in the evenings when water and forage made camping early a good idea in the mind of the caravan master, she taught herself how to weave silk on a fine little loom John constructed for her. She undid her first few attempts and had John double the number of threads in the warp and provide a lever for cinching the weft, and tried again. Her goal was to make cloth which would hold water. Ever since she had first laid eyes on John, cloth which would hold water was in her mind the standard of excellence. John tried to tell her that he much preferred the light, airy wool layers for the vagaries of temperature produced in these climes, but she was certain that cloth which held water was the richest possible, and perhaps she was right. It might be the most value she could add to the thread, to make with it waterproof cloth. In fact, John could think of several things he could build with waterproof cloth. Amazing and valuable things. Make a note, he thought to himself. Find rubber trees. John had to retie the warp threads onto a smooth waxed rod at the top and bottom, and the loops were pushed against each other tightly. The combination of such a tight warp and a levered weft made for the finest silk cloth, which, while it got damp when asked to hold water, didn't let water drip through it. A little waterproofing, and it would do for water containers, waterproof clothing, or tents. It was such a trial to pack up the wet felt roof of the nomadic tents. And John thought to himself in fiendish satisfaction, hang gliders, parafoils, hot air balloons, air mattresses, and, layered with insulation and sealed with rubber coating, additional survival suits. Although John was a procurer and not a scout, he ate with them, and doubled on the scouting duties when his spirits directed him in a certain direction, freeing one of the scouts to cover another area. Sometimes he took Zithrusa with him, that is, she insisted on coming along. She often was able to take smaller game that he didn't see in time, adding rabbits and marmosets, geese and pheasants to the larder. If it had been the height of the caravan season, there would be much less provender to acquire. On one such foray, the two were discovered by a scouting party of a local warrior king, or a better organised form of bandit. Thinking that 2 on foot would be an easy target, the 6 men dismounted, and the youngest was regulated to holding the reins of their shaggy little ponies. The other 5 drew their bows and attempted to make sport of target with John and Zithrusa. The range was great enough that there was time to dodge 1 or 2 arrows, but 5 was making the game crucial. Zithrusa slung, keeping the jesting assassins off their mark, while John played a game of his own. John targeted the bowstrings of the attackers, figuring that for each he cut with his own arrows, it was 1 less sniper he had to deal with. 3 arrows later, and 3 opposing bows were useless against them. Zithrusa had knocked 2 senseless with slung stones, but one was one of which John had already cut the string of his bow. The men struggled to get their wounded mounted, as John and Zithrusa strolled nearer. The last one with a bow or one of the others who picked up a dropped bow, made to fire, whether in bravado or defence, John neither knew nor cared. John just knew it was time to stop playing around. 3 quick shots, and 4 bodies lay on the sward. Zithrusa also slung a shot at the last man holding the ponies. They walked up, secured the ponies, and made sure of the fallen enemy. Well, Zithrusa did. It was the prerogative of the women in the battlefield to give mercy and take loot. 6 horses, 2 swords, John would classify them as scimitars, 6 knives, 5 bows, 66 arrows, no, 72 by the time they collected the ones fired at them. A few articles of clothing worth scavenging. Not too bad. Now to find the game, since they had horses to haul it back with. The 2 traded the 6 horses for 2 somewhat larger Arabian horses, delicate-looking yet desert-hardy, to some nomads who didn't think the Arabians would last long the hardships of the steppes. Each came out of the barter, thinking they had gotten the best of the other, a fine ending to a bargaining session. Now John and Zithrusa could range further on the hunt, and Zithrusa didn't have to get her boots dusty, walking along beside the caravan. John found on one of his hunting scouting trips an ambuscade in the making, about 20 bowmen on one side of the trail, and 10 men with spears and swords on the other. John reported his findings to the caravan master, and asked for permission to take the scouts out to counter the attack as it happened. The caravan master gave John control of the scouts, and of course Zithrusa would go too. The lead scout objected, on the grounds that she was a mere woman. "I am a woman, yes, but I am also a warrior. All of my family are warriors, down to the 9-year-old girl child. I am a woman with a fierce love and protectiveness towards my man. And I am also a fighter, able to kill to protect my husband and my family. This is how it is for those of us who live in the open, with no walls around us. We are each of us a wall of protection surrounding the rest of our family. When raiders and bandits came, the women also fought, and fought well. They died, and they didn't die alone. The children fought, boys and girls both, and in our stories are tales of all the family killed while killing our enemies. Once down to an auntie and 12 children under 8 to continue the family, and we returned from that brink of doom, and once there was a girl woman of 12, who was the oldest, and 20 children younger, and we also survived that, killed all our enemies, keeping only an old blind enemy elder for our face, to deal with the world. It is the world which doesn't value women, the family values all of itself." The old scout was abashed at this diatribe, and said no more, recognising that indeed Zithrusa was a warrior and a scout and had killed man and beast to protect her charges. John sent the 8 scouts against the 20 bowmen, while he and Zithrusa crept up on the 10 spearmen. They slithered among the rocks and brush, quietly eliminating the hidden men from each side of the line. Zithrusa met John at the body of his 4th kill, grinning and teasing him for being so slow. "Let's go help those scouts now. They were outnumbered over 2 to 1, said Zithrusa slyly. But when they arrived, there were only scouts and bodies and no enemy left. Gathering the loot and backtracking the would-be ambushers to see what else awaited, they reported their success to the caravan master. The scouts kept the best of the bows for themselves, and John claimed the best sword, an incongruous sword with a slight curve and watermarks as if a Damascus blade. John had no idea if there was a Damascus in this time, or if this was a fine example of high-carbon Indian steel, but it was a very fine blade, strong, supple, and deadly. John practiced, using the blade's properties to perfect his style. It lent itself very well to slashing, so he avoided a technique of bashing and bludgeoning in favour of the deft slice, which with this weapon would go right through leather and flesh. Around the fire, John made a wooden and leather sheath for the sword, and on his hunts practiced drawing it quickly and smoothly in one motion, turning that motion into a killing slice. He once snuck up on a desert auroch, the great black beast with its horns sweeping out, and then back in a graceful arc, ending up pointing two needle-sharp points straight forward side by side right in front of the monster's forehead. It turned to look at John, standing a few feet from it, and he quickly drew his sword and sliced the head right off of its massive neck. The beast hardly had time to look surprised before it had pumped the last of its life's blood into the barren soil. John noted the grey stripe running from head to tail down the black hide, and he had to drag the near ton of meat back to the caravan behind his and Zithrusa's horses by its hind legs. John didn't exactly enjoy killing the magnificent animals such as the tiger or the desert auroch, but humans were not in ascendancy in this time, and were not destroying species, their habitat and their environment. It was John using primitive weapons, giving the animals equal chances to kill him. A wounded tiger could still kill 20 men, and often did. The only safe way to hunt tigers for sport was from the back of an elephant, and even so, men died. The response of the caravan to John and Zithrusa bringing in the auroch was telling, especially when Zithrusa bragged that he had taken it with his sword. It was the mark of utmost bravery to take an auroch single-handedly, or even to participate in killing one no matter how many men were involved. To face one at sword-strike distance was heroic. John was a hero to everyone in the caravan, and he was very embarrassed. He had just been trying out his sword technique. The caravan master had a weighty choice to make: to take the northern route, through the territory of the warlike Scythians, or to take the southern route, and chance not finding water or forage for the pack beasts. The Scythians were very manly, and liked to challenge travellers to contests, intending to prove their betters. While not very large or imposing, they were feisty and gung-ho. Perhaps they had that banty temper, the short man's need to prove something. If they won the contests with the travellers, they might consider them nebushees, incapable of protecting their goods, and it might incite them to attack and or steal the caravan's belongings. If the travellers won the challenges, it would have to be done in a way which didn't offend the Scythians' touchy sense of honour. This late in the caravan season, though, it was very risky to travel the southern route. With a hope of the good fates, the caravan master signalled for the caravan to take the northern path, and they moved off towards Samarkand. Because John hadn't made an issue about the tiger skin, the caravan master couldn't really make any issue with John keeping the pelts he acquired as he hunted. He didn't seek out or track or trap the furs he occasioned, rather they just fell into his lap, as it were. He extended them on a frame of wood where they dried quickly in the dry air enough that flies weren't interested. Light, they soon made a large bundle on their half-camel load. The clothing the people they bypassed wore gradually changed from wool robes to leather pants and vests, and soft, short leather boots fastened with a strap about the ankle. John wanted some pants too, so he made himself and Zithrusa leather pants from the auroch hide that Zithrusa had cured. In a fit of whimsy, he had constructed both sets so that the grey stripe ran up the outside of their legs, the hair pointing down, of course. It made for a very snazzy pair of trousers, and incidentally boldly advertised that the leather had come from a full-grown bull auroch, as immature males lacked the stripe, and females were coloured a reddish-brown. There were just as many women wearing trousers as men, and as many were armed with bows and knives. The market in Samarkand was chaos, with deals and trades happening constantly, and in many cases, concluding only to have the person who just obtained an item turn around and trade it away for something else. Many sharp traders bargaining made for a cacophony of noise, a great babble of sound that stunned the senses. John hid in his tent for the first day, unwilling to face such crowds, while Zithrusa was enthralled, her first visit to the big city. She spent the day going here and there, It was 20 times the size of a gathering, with much more goods to choose from. She window shopped and got an idea of values and worth, and listened to what values might be further along the trail. She saw her first chariots, mostly four-wheeled utility versions, carrying the rich and their baggage, not the sporty two-wheeled ones used for war or sport, although she did see a few. She learned of the chariot races held outside of town on a big track, and the next day dragged John there to watch. A suffocating crowd while shopping was one thing, and John found he could stand the sporting crowd, all standing still and focused on the event. The track was a wide loop, starting and ending before the stadium, which was a slope on a hillside, affording a view of the event to all comers. At the far end, nothing could be seen except for a cloud of dust, from which emerged the leader, evolving into the winner. There was no second place, only the winner and the losers, so the races were usually ran in pairs. John noticed that the horses used were mostly the shaggy, stocky ponies, not the elegantly lined Arabian horses such as his and Zithrusa's. He mentioned it to her, and her eyes lit up. She coached him on values, and prepared him to front for her. They approached a man dressed in leather breeches, highly decorated yet well worn at the seat and on the insides of the legs. He was wearing what looked like a huge leather shoe on his head, the toe pointed up and to the front. His silk shirt was covered with a sheepskin vest, also patterned and dyed in bright colours, fleece side in. His hair was oiled and long, unconstrained, and his moustaches were long and flowing. He smiled greeting at John, revealing crooked yellowing teeth, which were, however, sound and strong. He and John sat on stools and drank a mild beer which tasted like lawn clippings, and John started by admiring the man's horses, which he had just won the race with. "I have never raced a chariot," began John, "but it doesn't seem very difficult. How do you hire your drivers?" The chariot owner hid his small grimace in his beard. This didn't seem like it would be a profitable exchange. "My drivers are all expert with the whip. They never touch my precious horses. Any mark on their hides would be cause for the driver to be whipped," he stated, preparing to make some excuse to end the interview and attend to other business. "I have a pair of fine western horses which would beat your horses by a quarter of the track," John stated quietly, instantly gaining the man's full attention. He looked around and made certain no one could overhear them. "If you raced my horses against some that would beat your best and my horses won, wouldn't that be worth a lot of winnings?" The chariot owner was intrigued. This was the type of scheme he loved. "Let me look at your horses," he told John, and if he had been the kind of man to make appointments, he would have cancelled them. The man was very impressed by the looks of the horses and asked John what he was looking for in exchange. John started out asking 4 camels for the 2 horses and was surprised when the man accepted without demur. At an emphatic signal from Zithrusa, he clarified, "Forgive me if I don't speak your language very well. I meant the Bactrian, not the dromedary." The man blinked in surprise and asked John if he had 2 drivers, as it would take a driver for every 2 Bactrian camels. When John indicated that he didn't, the man offered to provide 2 Bactrian camels and a driver for John. When John inquired about wages for the driver, the man laughed and said, "Slaves need no wages." John was reluctant to acquire a slave and asked to meet the driver first. Zithrusa had no prejudice against slavery and was all for the trade, but John was balking. The driver proved to be a smiling, friendly man. Not at all as John had envisioned a slave's demeanour to be, and with Zithrusa's urging, after all they did need a driver, John acquiesced. Both men thought they got a good bargain, and they were smiling and clapping shoulders like old friends as they parted, each with his new riches. John's attempt to free his new slave was an utter failure, and only confused and bewildered Wong, and angered Zithrusa, who thought John's status as a slave owner was greater than his status as non-owner. She was holding off on the second wife idea for now, since they were under hardship of travel, but she was keeping her eyes open for a suitable second wife, the higher class the better for enhancing her own status as head wife. To think she had dreamed of being a third wife, and she might become first wife over a princess. When John told Wong he was setting him free, Wong was dismayed. "You won't feed me and protect me anymore?" he asked sadly. "No, I will pay you for working, but you can leave any time," clarified John. "Better you own me. Then no one can hurt me without you stopping them," argued Wong brightly. "I only need food and a place to sleep. I work hard for you. If you not own me, any pay you give me would only be taken by others, and I would be hungry again." Wong preferred the security of having someone else be responsible. John gave up and resigned himself to being a slave owner, privately vowing, however, to make certain Wong remained happy, and to free him with remuneration if he ever showed signs of wanting a different life for himself. Zithrusa used John as face to find bargains and goods to load their 2 camels, or rather, Bactrian beasts of burden with. They traded some of John's carvings for wool carpets and felt tapestries, saffron and furs. His carvings had gained a reputation on the trade routes as being magical talismans which enhanced a hunter's luck. Soon the 2 camels were loaded, and Wong drove them back to the caravanserai on the outskirts of the city. John only once had to throw one of his knives through the hand of a would-be thief before the word spread and they were able to proceed unmolested. He held the man's head pulled back by the hair as he retrieved his knife, and growled softly in his ear that the next person who put his hand where it didn't belong would lose it. John had Zithrusa use her first silk to construct a proof-of-concept 2-man pup tent, a snug, wind-proof tent that was actually less drafty than their own wool and felt tent, and much lighter too. They gave its use to Wong, and he was astonished at the luxury of a silk tent that was even dyed a pleasing rose hue. He vowed to himself that he would work hard to please such wonderful masters as John and Zithrusa. An added benefit to having Wong join them is that he was from the East originally, and knew several of the major languages. It was perfectly acceptable to have a slave translate for one all along the trade route, and many caravans had various slaves along just for that purpose, as well as any other work needed. So far, Zithrusa's language was in wide usage, or secondary usage, but that would soon change as they progressed to the east. John soon learned that food for himself and his wife also included dependents, such as a child or a slave. He asked the caravan master about when or where they might find undyed silk thread, as it was too costly to make tents from dyed thread. The caravan master suggested that there would be silk thread cheap enough in Kashgar, another month down the road. He asked John if he could use John as champion in case of any challenges by the Scythians, who favoured themselves as bowmen, and John agreed. He set himself to making rifled arrows, as the ones he had found locally were fletched in line with the shaft. He sought out the best shafts and gave each feather a slight angle to impart spin to the arrow in flight. He also had a smith produce mild flat iron arrowheads which were soft enough that John could give them a slight twist to match. He now had arrows that were very stable in flight and had an improved range. Coupled with John's already excellent bowmanship, it gave uncanny results. Trading done, the caravan packed up and continued eastwards. John had started to make carvings of local animals, such as the golden eagles, the leopards, the great red foxes, and the auroch, both male and female. He had woods which, when polished, provided colours very near the actual colours of the animal, with the exception of the leopards, which he solved by picking a blonde wood and burning the spots in with a hot wand of metal. He and his wife and slave, John just could not get used to the thought of owning another human being, rubbed the polished pieces against their noses and behind their ears to put a glossy sheen on the wood and to protect it from drying out. The result was amazing, lifelike, artistic, and magical. John carefully put these pieces away for future use. Note to self, he told himself, sail-driven chariots. John also kept his rifled arrows under wraps, although he did take one hunting to test its limitations. It was amazing what he could do. It flew so far and true. He couldn't even see the mark he was aiming at, yet he was able to think his arrow to that target. Zithrusa now had 2.5 camels. We assume everyone knows that all camels in the caravan are Bactrian camels. Worth of goods, yet she had to walk in the dust once more. She refused to ride one of the camels as luggage, so she ended up trudging along. Being a nomad woman, she was used to walking, but day after day it got old. She asked John about it, and he told her he would think about it and see what he could come up with. There were more walled outposts and caravanserai with permanent guards posted to protect the traders. They were staffed with soldiers from the Eastern Emperor, probably as a punishment duty. Sometimes a commander just got too popular, either with the soldiers or with some official's wife. In any case, they ended up in the back of Beyond, keeping filthy traders from being attacked by misbegotten barbarians. They drank a lot of plum wine, and some had taken up the habit of inhaling the smoke of the hemp flowers, a habit picked up from the Scythians who used it ceremonially. There was no ceremony for the Eastern soldiers. They just sat in the closed room with the small charcoal burner and threw the dried flower tops onto the coals. Eventually, they had to leave the room as it became too smoky to breathe. They got smoked out. One of these outposts, a caravanserai they stayed at for 2 days while they waited clear weather to go over the mountain pass, had a problem, and the captain who asked the caravan master for help was directed to John. The local ruler had issued a challenge, and to refuse it was asking to have the caravanserai destroyed. The challenge was to provide an unarmed man to master a leopard. Everyone knew that an unarmed man against a leopard was suicide, and the captain couldn't find anyone who would accept the challenge. John sighed and Zithrusa shrugged. She would leave this one up to John. John decided that he needed to consult his spirits and asked for some time to consider the request. He went off by himself and meditated, seeking the voice of the spirits. John, this beast isn't your enemy. Treat her right and she will be very loving towards you. That was strange. It was a good hint though, and John decided to accept the challenge on behalf of the Empire's soldiery. He returned to the captain and told him his decision. He asked that only the captain go along as an observer and not interfere no matter what happened. The captain was grateful to have someone answer the challenge which unanswered might destroy his post and get all his men killed. Zithrusa wanted to go along, but John insisted that this time was a time for him to go alone. On arriving at the ruler's fort, they were invited to drink and eat, but John refused all food and wine, accepting only water and bread. The ruler explained the challenge, to master a leopard while weaponless. John indicated that he understood, so the challenge began forthwith. John, in order to prove he was unarmed and to leave no room for quibble later, removed all clothing but for a clout, and entered the small arena with a 10-foot-high surrounding wall. A leopard was let into the room from the other side, and John watched as it noticed him and began to approach. He noticed that its ears were forward, and she wasn't attacking, and he further noticed other things about her, such as she was a female leopard as the spirits had said, and that she wasn't relating to him as an enemy, quite the opposite. From the way her raised tail was jerking, she was in heat. Treat her right indeed. He circled around her in the way she was circling him, and they gradually closed in on each other in the middle. John suddenly turned and grabbed her by the scruff of her neck tightly, giving the loose fur there a slight twist and grabbing the base of her tail with his right hand. She instinctively crouched down, raising her hindquarters. John massaged her bottom around her tail, and she raised her rear higher as John moved his hand lower, inserting 2 of his fingers into her hot, swollen flesh, ignoring the gasp he heard from the aghast captain. John knew that male leopards had backward-facing spikes on their pricks, and it was the stimulus of these spikes which induced ovulation in the female. So he began lightly gouging the inner surface of the leopardess's twat with his fingernails, causing her to snarl alarmingly. He judged his moment, and withdrew his hand and released her ruff, jumping back in time to avoid her perfunctory swipe. She spent a minute or 2 licking herself, and then approached John, who sat still. She purred throatily as she rubbed her chin against him, marking him with her scent. The door opened again and the satisfied leopardess exited the arena, her tail held high and switching beguilingly. John rose, exited the arena and dressed. He was soon rejoined by the ruler and the captain. "You have certainly mastered the leopardess," the ruler said heartily. "I am honoured to meet such a man. I have a daughter who is the human equivalent of that little cat, my pet. I don't suppose you wish to tame her as well?" John demurred. "After taming your little pet cat, a woman would be too easy, and I would grow bored. However, perhaps the captain, emboldened by my example, would consider taming your wild child," said John, looking meaningfully at the captain, almost a nudge of a gaze. The captain shook himself free of the shock of what he had just observed and stepped up to the challenge. He was astute enough to understand that taking the ruler's daughter to wife would protect him, his men, and the caravanserai from attack, at least by this ruler. It didn't matter what she looked like, and if she was as hard to tame as the leopard, at least her claws wouldn't be as long or as sharp. "I would gladly attempt to show as much bravery and mastery as John here, and take on the task of being husband to your daughter," he said bravely, hoping she wasn't a pig as well as a shrew. The ruler said, "Excellent," and clapped his hands twice. The young woman who came in, moving with the grace the leopardess had shown, almost made John sorry he had turned down the ruler's offer. However, he had his hands full already with Zithrusa, and he hoped his second wife would be a woman who would content herself with secondary status in the marriage, else there would be constant warfare in his household. Zithrusa would never accept secondary status among wives. She had long, shiny black hair, dark, smoky eyes which challenged and threatened, sensual, pouty lips which begged to be kissed and yet complained in their very set, promising to be very hard to please. John almost felt sorry for the captain. She seemed to be over the age of 14, but how much over was difficult to tell. It appeared that she had been indulged in her every whim as a child, and now as a woman grown, she was too full of her own importance to be a good wife. John hoped that the lesson he had given using the leopardess as an example had been understood by the captain. Zithrusa had to content herself with the news that John had mastered a grown leopard while unarmed, in fact while unrobed. John refused to discuss it, and the captain wouldn't say any more than that. It galled her, but she had to accept that there were some things she wouldn't know about her John. The caravan left the next morning, declining to stay for the wedding. John gave the captain a carving of a crouching leopardess he had been inspired to create several weeks earlier, with her rump and tail lifted invitingly, looking coyly back over her shoulder, and told him to use it as bride price and to offer nothing else. If questioned, tell the ruler that any other gift would demean this one, and to mention that it was John himself who had carved it. The captain was grateful for the gift and the advice. John thought it best to let the captain work out on his own how to best tame his new bride. The captain gallantly gave his horse to Zithrusa as a gift as they departed, saying she was too pretty to be dragged in the dust. Of course, there were other reasons for the gift, but John allowed the captain the fiction and Zithrusa's gratitude. She also allowed the fiction, although she knew the horse was somehow the result of her complaint to John. She was satisfied in any case. The most bulky items on the camels, and which would increase the least as they progressed eastwards, were the skins. These, moreover, replenished themselves as they went. John and Zithrusa agreed to dispose of them advantageously at the next promising opportunity, and replace their volume with more wood. John had used up much of the wood on animal carvings, and had branched into 2 other types of carvings, both of which embarrassed Zithrusa greatly. He began carving very lifelike images of Zithrusa herself, nude and in seductive and suggestive poses. The smooth wood made one yearn to touch and caress it. It was hypnotic and entrancing. Although she was embarrassed, Zithrusa was certain that anyone who held one of these pieces would pay almost any price to possess it. John had captured or brought out something in the wood, a female spirit of seduction like a dryad. The other things John began carving were lingam, life-sized or slightly larger, of erect male genitalia, with every curve, vein and wrinkle lovingly depicted. The eggs nestled in their stretched sac, and it was the counterpart to the magical effect of the nymph carvings. Zithrusa found herself absently caressing one without realizing it, and when she did she would blush deeply. She wanted to rub her face against the smooth, warm wood, run it against her lips, touch it with her tongue. She came to herself with a start, and knew that this also would find a willing market. She couldn't resist from trying one out, and not only did her oils give it a magical sheen, a glow that seemed to outline the very essence of the wood, but it was curved just so to give her amazing pleasure, so much that she overflowed with it. She learned from then on to make certain that when she polished one of the lingams for its final coating, she should make certain one of the absorbent cotton pads was under her to catch the overflow. When John found her so engaged, he watched quietly, and after that insisted that she let him watch her, and at the proper time allow him to seal her with his mouth and drink her nectar. Even so, she produced so much that it overflowed his mouth faster than he could swallow, and ran down his neck and chest. John gave her his water ration and drank from the fountain of love, and was inspired to produce more carvings for her to baptize. He made a smaller version just for her that she could insert while riding her horse. She wore her robes on these occasions, and a pair of tiny silk garments which John called panties. The horse blanket was a bit thicker and more absorbent than normal, and was somehow completely soaked in horse sweat by the end of her rides. It fit inside her so nicely, filling her up without being too uncomfortable. Her panties got soaked despite being of waterproof silk, and the movement of the horse made the little protrusion on the top rub her buzz button thrillingly. The horse riders in this time and area didn't use leather saddles or stirrups, just a light pad or blanket strapped around the horse's belly. John thought if he was going to be on a horse very much, he would have to invent a saddle with stirrups. His little invention for Zithrusa's pleasure was stirring her up. She transferred her lust onto John in the nights, and there were many complaints of panthers and leopards in the mornings. Wong moved the silk tent over by the camels so he could watch over them, at the Kokon crossroads, in the dirty little town which squatted there for no other reason than to provide drink and food to the caravans, while their masters made up their minds to take the right fork or the left, or to leave messages to each other. John and Zithrusa nonetheless managed to trade the skins for wood. They even got some skeins of raw silk thread at exorbitant rates, but both the wood and silk would be worth more by the time John and Zithrusa were done adding value. Then the skins would increase by being transported eastwards. Having an equal volume of carvings and silk would increase their wealth tenfold, or even 100-fold over the same volume of furs. Although valuable in the East, the furs just weren't as high value as the silk tents and carvings which the raw silk and cured wood would become. The furs were more valuable than the wood and thread as such, here and now. The fur trader thought they were fools, but worth is what a person values after all. Besides, they got all the wood and thread their camels could carry. A week after leaving the squalid fork in the road, they came to another fork, this time merely the rejoining of the southern route back onto the trail. Ironically, it was here that they encountered trouble of the kind they might have sought to avoid by taking the southern trail in the first place. A local Scythian warlord, actually a few days' ride from his own territory but bored and looking for trouble, accosted the caravan, demanding it produce a champion. When John was presented, he laughed and mocked, asking if this pitiful example was the best they could come up with. John begged the warlord's forgiveness and said he hoped he would give good sport to any challenge the warlord had to offer them. He then added that perhaps the warlord would want to select a champion from his men, to avoid personal shame if the Scythians lost the challenge. Infuriated, the warlord proclaimed that he himself would participate in any challenge. John, in order to lock his trap, asked if the warlord was the equal of any of his men. The warlord boasted that he was the better of any of his men. Sealing the deal, John asked innocently, "So if I best you, I best all of your men as well?" And the poor fool answered that of course he did, in front of many witnesses. The legalities taken care of, John was prepared to accept the challenges. The warlord was proud of his swordsmanship and wanted to cut John down a notch or two, so he suggested they cross swords. John was agreeable to that and stood with his sword still sheathed. The warlord invited him to draw, and he said there was time enough for that when the warlord attacked him. Infuriated by this cavalier attitude, the warlord raised his naked sword and aimed it at John's neck in an overhand blow. John, having previously noticed a large notch 18 inches from the hilt of the warlord's sword, drew his high carbon blade and sliced at the warlord's sword at that precise spot. His edge caught in the large nick and sliced right through the sword, leaving the warlord stumbling and vulnerable with a stub of sword in his hand. John stepped back and offered his first excuse. "The test was of the swordsman, not the sword. We must call this contest a draw due to faulty equipment." Cleverly, John gave the warlord a draw rather than a win or loss, allowing him to save face without winning. The warlord had been badly frightened, however, by the speed of John's draw, and knew in his heart that his sword failed due to no mere chance. He noticed before John sheathed his sword that it bore no mar to its edge. "What is the next challenge?" asked John when it looked like the warlord was lost in thought. "Next we shall contest as to who is the better archer," the warlord stated. Surely John couldn't be as good an archer as he was a swordsman. The archery range was paced off at the limit of what the warlord felt comfortable of hitting his mark. John politely urged the warlord to proceed first. The warlord fired 5 arrows at the target, and all 5 clustered closely around the bull's eye. John stepped up to the mark and quickly sent 5 arrows downrange as fast as he could draw and release. A gasp arose from the spectators, and John offered his second excuse. "Look, we are evenly matched. We have both hit the exact same marks," he exclaimed with false camaraderie. The target was brought back and closely examined, and John's 5 arrows had split each of the warlord's arrows down the middle, entering the target between the halves of the warlord's arrows. "A tie so far," John proclaimed. "What is the next challenge?" And then he knocked another arrow and let fly nearly straight up into the air, and a honking squawk was heard, and a large snowy goose fell at their feet, one of John's arrows through its head. "I missed, I was trying for its breast," lied John, looking directly into the warlord's eyes. The warlord felt a chill pass up his spine. He didn't know of any other challenge he might beat John at, and by matching him in such a way, indicating to any who dared to speak it that he had beat him, John had also beat every man follower of his as well, by his own admission. He really didn't want to continue with the challenges, but custom indicated he present at least one more. "Very well, we shall essay a drinking contest," challenged the warlord, gratified to see John's eyes twitch. There was nothing for it but to match the warlord drink for drink. John got very, very drunk, but he didn't pass out. He kept drinking even when he was in a blacked-out state, and he didn't remember anything which occurred after the 6th or 7th drink. Finally, he keeled over, instinct unable to keep his muscles erect anymore, and there was a long pause before the warlord tipped over also. The caravan master and the warlord's second held a hasty conference, and soon the caravan was on, its way down the road to Kashgar, poor John face down over a swaying camel which was oblivious to the vomit he decorated its side with. The warlord's men told him only that he had decisively won the 3rd challenge when he awoke the evening of the 2nd day following, without telling him how near the win had been. John was hungover for 4 full days afterwards, drinking lots of water but taking no food lest he return it to the ground. While John recovered from his hangover, he carved a round-faced, horned, fanged, clawed demon, with bulging eyes and an insane leer. When Zithrusa saw the glowering form, she insisted that John cover it in a leathern sack, and wouldn't look at it anymore. John poured all of his hangover into the squat, malevolent figure. He smoothed it, but put no polish to it, then put it away and forgot about it. The 4th night, Zithrusa seduced John, using all of her feminine wiles to interest him in her sexually deprived and depraved body. Her yoni was hot enough to melt tallow when John stopped his self-pity party long enough to dip his wick in her cauldron of love. He felt much better then, and afterwards she got him to drink some broth like when she had taken care of him the first time. They both enjoyed going back to their early days, and John even went so far as to pretend to be helpless, at the point sometime after he regained control of his bladder, that is, and dependent upon Zithrusa. She enjoyed mothering him, talking to him as if he was a small child. This time she used her new wanton knowledge of his perverse ways, and pleasured him with her mouth, and rode him like a cowgirl. John thought he might have to teach her just what silk scarves were for. John took a giant stag, which looked like a cross between an elk and a moose, but without the moose's nose. He seemed to remember seeing a picture of an Irish stag, but he was sure he wasn't in Ireland, no matter what year it was. He couldn't remember when such an animal might have existed, but shrugged it off as not really important. As long as he didn't meet up with a saber-toothed lion, or a cave bear, or an enraged mammoth, he wouldn't worry about it. Even if it was an animal from out of time, there were such things as remnant populations after supposed general extinction, and come to that, John himself was an animal out of his own time, looking decidedly odd in his orange suit. The caravan didn't pay much special attention, aside to remark on the size of the beast's rack, so John put it from his mind. The next several weeks saw Zithrusa construct a light, airy tent to replace their wool and felt monstrosity, so old-fashioned. The translucent silk panels let in much light, and John had to remember to keep light sources from having he and Zithrusa put on a shadow show at night. He mentioned it to her, and she got very excited and practically attacked him in her wanton lusts. She was getting to be so perverse. Who knew she had a kink for exhibitionism? Perhaps was an effect of being stimulated under her robes as she rode her horse, secretly dripping her juices of lust into her saddle pad right in front of everyone. It was all John's fault. She was a nice girl when he met her, well on her way to becoming a maiden auntie. They recycled the textiles from the tent, the old heavy tent that is. The walls became trade blankets, and the heavy old felt roof could be made into inserts for boots. Zithrusa had a hard time keeping up with her weaving, and had John make a second loom, and had Wong join her in weaving the 3-foot wide by 10 feet long waterproof silk panels. It took a little over 2 days to make one panel, but with 2 of them working, they completed 5 a week. Zithrusa thought that in spite of being waterproof, silk would be less valuable the more east they went, so they decided to trade all the silk they produced in Kashgar in exchange for high-value, low-volume goods such as saffron and rubies. They decided that selling tents would bring better barter than just selling the silk panels, so John became tent maker as well as carpenter-carver. He made round pavilion-style tents with 6-foot walls, as getting the most volume from the material. 6 panels for the walls gave an interior of nearly 18 feet across, and the roof took about 5 more, John thought. He just sewed the pattern that Zithrusa cut out for him. John only had 2 of the tents completed when they arrived in Kashgar, but they were beautiful with white and rose panels, and the top held up by a centre pole. The roof at the centre was 10 feet high, sloping down to 6 feet on the edges. It was a mobile palace, a Winnebago of a tent. Because there were only 2, it made them more valuable. Actually, there were 3, but John and Zithrusa were in no way going to go back to the felt roof tent, which was so last year, and various people clamoured to obtain them. In fact, there was almost a riot. Well, there were a few brawls. Finally, they sold both tents for a fortune in rubies to the same man, who made a profit anyhow by reselling them the next day. They decided the rubies were a good form to carry value in, as they could walk away with no visible goods, yet still have the same value as 2 camels loaded with carpets and furs. Speaking of which, they traded all their carpets and tapestries for more silk thread and more saffron, as it was a low-volume, high-value trade item. They also picked up more jewels for some select carvings. Zithrusa held a John's secret party, with only women invited, and got much treasure in jewels for showing and demonstrating the use of the irresistible wooden objects. The ladies were much impressed with her love fontaine, and she was able to induce most of them to similar outpourings. The carvings became all the rage of the ladies in the know, a simply must-have item. John couldn't bring himself to pander the carvings of his wife to lecherous strangers' thought, although the idea was secretly thrilling to Zithrusa. He did find a ready market for the animal carvings, though, and found that his favourite subjects, the eagle, fox, leopard and auroch, were also iconic and patriotic subjects for the locals as well. After a few times of being so insulted that he refused to sell to a particular patron of the arts, he found the rest hardly bargained at all, paying much what he asked for without quibble. The city of Kashgar put Samarkand to shame. It was at least 4 times as large, with goods constantly entering and leaving the city. There was anything to be had here, for a price. John sought out the weapon makers and asked them if they had ever seen the like of his sword. Chasing down rumours and vague recollections, John finally came upon a child's sword, made for some youngling prince, and of the same kind of wonder steel as his own sword. He acquired it for far less than it was worth to him, which was amazing given how difficult it was for him to keep his interest from showing. It was probably the fact that he already had a sword of the same steel, and that the little lightweight blade was obviously too small for him, that got him what he perceived as a wonderful bargain. At another stall, Kashgar had actual stalls rather than spread blankets of goods. He found several long knives of the same steel and obtained all three. One was for Wong, and he would give a knife and the light sword to Zithrusa. He intended to keep the last knife of watered Indian high-carbon steel for himself, as a match for his sword. After all, you can't skin a wolf with a sword. The caravan master also decided he could carry higher value goods than raw silk further east, no matter it was Tyrian purple. The colour at least got him a good profit when he traded for turquoise, crystal, glass beads, and furs. John traded him all of his nymph carvings and tried not to think about the caravan master fondling them. He got another treasure in jewels and hoped the caravan master would be able to bring himself to let the carvings go, else he would never profit from this trip. Wong was trained in detecting glass masquerading as jewels, and there was no more subtle forgery available in this time, aside from garnets of fine quality passing for rubies. Once you had a handful of rubies, though, the garnets tended to stick out. Wong could discern aquamarines from emeralds as well. John had Zithrusa sew some silk scanties to go with her panties, and all he had to do to get her dripping and panting with lust was to threaten to tie her up on display for strangers to view. He teased her with charging a fee to permit them to fondle her, and she had an orgasm on the spot. She really was a wanton wench, a randy little minx. She managed to get careless with backlighting and put on quite the shadow show at night against the walls of their tent. It is amazing how a shadow can seem longer with the right angle, and the legend of John grew. By this time, John and Zithrusa were wearing their trousers mostly, unless Zithrusa wanted to go horseback riding in her robes and with her thick absorbent saddle pad. John also found that a sheepskin vest was all the cover his torso needed, and with his sword, knives, bow and arrows, he looked quite the warrior. Since it was the style, he grew a single mustachio on his upper lip, but didn't go for the beard and lower mustachio look. Not that he could produce a respectable beard anyway. He lacked only a claw necklace to complete his barbaric look, although he didn't have the beard to actually be a barbarian. He made himself a tiger claw necklace almost as soon as he thought of it, and the effect of the claws of such a dangerous creature coupled with the trousers made from the equally dangerous creature made John seem very dangerous indeed, which, in fact, he was. Zithrusa allowed him his play-acting dress-up, but had his rich man's robes packed and waiting for their approach to more civilized countries. It was good to look dangerous to deter thieves and bullies, but John would have to change his style when among more civilized cultures. After all, they were becoming rather wealthy, and would need to play the part when they moved in like society. Soon it was time to move on, and the caravan master now carried no silk thread, except what was on John and Zithrusa's camels. The camels were loaded with less weight and bulk, although they hardly seemed to notice. They left Kashgar by the northern route, again dictated by the availability of water and forage. In the dry season, there just wasn't enough to support travel. Wong was afraid of his new knife, not of its sharpness, but of the idea that he was armed. It meant that someone might challenge him to battle, not realizing that he was the property of John, and unable to accept a challenge on his own behalf. He compromised by wearing it behind his back, so he didn't seem armed to any who faced him. There it felt like a guard dog protecting his back, and not like a troublesome friend urging him to mischief. John practiced with Zithrusa sword technique, and she had a very different style than he. She tended to want to use the point to keep an attacker away from her, so he went with it. She didn't have the upper body strength to hack or bludgeon anyway, and John put a very sharp point on the narrow blade, which was rather anemic and light to begin with. He used a dense wood single stick and tried to bash, hack, and bludgeon her with it, and let her find her style of deflecting his swings and then stabbing the point at him. It didn't work if he used his own slicing style, but against a basher of average strength she was quite effective. Against Conan she would be brushed aside like a leaf due to his power. If you have the strength, bashing works fine. For Wong, he used his unobtrusive valet style. Wong often was able to sneak up on John and straighten his collar, or flick lint or dandruff from his shoulders and then fade back unobtrusively before John was even aware he was there. His approach was so subtle and obsequious that he just slipped in under the radar, so to speak. John had him practice coming up to brush away lint with a stick in his hand, and to try to touch John on the neck with the stick as he did so. At any time he thought he could do so without John noticing. It turned out that he could pick the exact moment when John was distracted, and for a few days John became quite jumpy at how often he felt the cool kiss of polished wood against his throat. So Wong added the notation, "credible assassin," to his resume. John asked Wong if he could do it for real, using his knife, and Wong said he could never even consider it without specific orders. John ordered Wong to use whatever means he needed to protect Zithrusa, John, and himself from deadly or injurious harm. It was interesting seeing the manly gleam come into Wong's eyes at that, and to note how he stood straighter and with more confidence. He had just been promoted from slave drover to slave bodyguard. Of course, he knew that if John was already aware of and facing the harm, it was to Wong to watch his back, not try to usurp his fight. Wong started training John as well, in the deportment of a man of means, Eastern style. He accepted the material that Zithrusa had painstakingly spun and woven so fine, but the cut of the garments wouldn't do at all. He retailored them, and while he was at it, made silk robes of the clothing silk Zithrusa had woven using plain, rose and purple thread in pleasing patterns. The robes were for Zithrusa, who needed to be even more of an adornment than she was already. He had John make a fan of silk and wood in the same pattern design, and taught Zithrusa and John the language of the fan. He also taught them their own private code of signals, so Zithrusa could more easily direct John. Of course, Zithrusa wouldn't know much more of what was going on than John did, being a nomadic goat herd, but Wong would be in attendance on her, to tell her what to signal John to do. So, Zithrusa would be Wong's face, and John would face for Zithrusa. It was all fascinating, the way a fan's flickers and pops could be so expressive with exact meaning. In fact, Zithrusa could communicate with only the fan, without even learning the language. At least as far as society went. Women weren't meant to say much anyway, and Wong would deal with communicating with servant staff and slaves. It was interesting for Zithrusa to have the boot on the other foot, and have to learn John and Wong's subtle signals of desired behaviour. She learned to simper, to tap with her fan lightly instead of slugging John's arm hard when he made an embarrassing joke, to keep her eyes down except for flirtatious glances. John had Zithrusa play for Wong her ergil, and they both sat entranced with her etheric transports. Wong told her that her playing gave her amazing status among women, and would make John famous for no other reason than her musical talent. Zithrusa blushed and was very pleased. Thereafter she worked even harder to become the epitome of the Eastern high-class wife. Wong started teaching John and Zithrusa the main aristocratic language. It was the equivalent of French among the royalty of 17th century Europe. All the important people spoke it, no matter their country of origin. There wasn't much hope of learning to speak it very well, Wong thought, but the advantages of understanding it were worth the effort to learn it. John, Wong and Zithrusa were quite entertaining to the caravanners as they dressed up to the nines, and simpered, flapped fans, and spoke the lisping language of the upper crust. They stopped making boorish comments, however, when Wong started sneaking up on them and brushing imaginary lint from their shoulders solicitously. John made matching slippers for Zithrusa, and at her instigation continued to produce many fine carvings of the kind that entranced women. She said that they alone might gain her acceptance into the social ranks of high society wives. Wong was uncomfortable wearing silk as he thought himself beneath such finery, but had to admit as the de facto factotum, it was what he should be wearing. John pointed out he was sleeping in a silk tent, so why not wear silk clothing? Logically it made sense, but it still felt to Wong like he was dressing up beyond his station. They soon got a chance to practice their upper crusty skills when they reached one of the outlying provinces of the Eastern Empire. There was a governor in his mansion, and Wong took a request for interview on behalf of John and Zithrusa, and returned with a luncheon invitation. Wong was careful to not let them overdress for the occasion, lest they embarrass the governor and his wife. It was embarrassing to Zithrusa. The governor's wife was very provincial and didn't know the fan language. She was very taken with Zithrusa, and fawned and made much of her. One thing she did know was cosmetics, so they went off and left the men to themselves, and Zithrusa learned the art of beauty enhancement. John had to bite his tongue, as the governor went boorishly on about his hunting prowess. John didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The governor's idea of a hunt involved hundreds of beaters, a handful of spearmen to guard his back, and 20 bowmen to fire after him, ensuring a kill. It was strange how the man went on about the sport of it all. John just nodded and practiced his rich man persona. Eventually, the ordeal was over, and he took a bemused Wong and a garish raccoon of Zithrusa back to the camp. Wong said that actually, the makeup was fair, if slightly overdone for upper class. John redressed in his trousers and vest, and went hunting his way, alone or with only his wife and slave along to help haul game back to camp. Okay, Zithrusa got plenty of game also with her deadly sling. He took a wild boar and almost got taken by a wild sow. Females are the deadlier of the species, especially when they are defending their family. Wong saved John's bacon when he grabbed one of the piglets, making it squeal as if it was being murdered, distracting the sow from John. Wong dropped the piglet and they all fled the scene, pausing only to grab the 300-pound boar and heave it onto the horse. Once the sow discovered all her get safe and sound, she was too busy reassuring them to give chase. The caravan loved John's story time, which he limited to once a week, to keep them wanting more. Right now he was telling them the story of Rambo, the deadly warrior who just wanted to be left in peace, and how all the petty warlords kept trying him on for size only to be decimated. He told of all the tricks and traps and bravery that the warrior, who had the same name as John had, and of his losses and sorrows. They all listened in slack-jawed amazement at hearing how one man could defeat many, with stampedes, loosing of dammed waters, grass fires, poisoned wells, caltrops, deadfalls, pitfalls, and avalanche. They all agreed that it would have been best for those warlords to leave John Rambo alone, and to not have hurt his young bride. John didn't use a last name. No one knew him as John Ritter, so speculation was rife that his apocryphal tale was autobiographical, and that he had done all those unimaginable things, killing all those men in all those horrific ways as a reaper mows grain. And so the mystery that was John grew dark and terrible, but highly entertaining. They remembered his mercy towards the warlord at the crossroads, and were comforted, presuming that as long as you didn't harm his young bride or push him beyond his limits, his beast would be contained, or limited to tigers and auroch. Unbeknownst to John, these rumours were encouraged by Wong as a means of helping protect his master. With his promotion to bodyguard, Wong was becoming quite the spy, disinformation psychological counter-intelligenista. After all, he did have a license to kill or use any other method to protect John and Zithrusa, and himself. He had taken his orders to heart, and was in fact using all his resources to ensure the safety of John and Zithrusa. Having strong protected masters also protected himself. Wong practiced the strengths that John had shown him he possessed, the skill of being unobtrusive, and developed it into ninja-like invisibility. No one notices the butler, or postman, or gardener, or servant, or slave. He became so unnoticeable that he often overheard conversations that the conversers were unaware of anyone else overhearing. He kept sneaking around, present yet unnoticed, practicing his intelligence gathering for when it would be useful, always on the lookout for any threats to the life and limb of his masters. He also redoubled his training of John and Zithrusa for their upcoming role as wealthy society people. John and Zithrusa were happy to learn, and they practiced all the time, getting better and better at it. Wong had been a rich man's accountant as a young man, but had foolishly embezzled a paltry amount, and had gotten caught. It is better to embezzle a very large amount at once, and to quit the premises before your crime is discovered, he thought for the 1000th time. Now he was a slave, but he was happier without the pressure of success or failure looming above him. Still, he knew all that was needed to know to make John a success, and he intended to make certain of it. He had a willing ally and co-conspirator in Zithrusa as well. Wong suggested various pleasing patterns Zithrusa could use for her clothing silk, and made certain John made matching slippers for each outfit. They were lined robes, the solid colour lining showing at the cuffs and lapels, contrasting the pleasing patterns woven into the garments. Wong undertook to add accents of embroidery where needed, and he was certain that Zithrusa would be setting the style, and would in fact be the best-dressed society wife extant. Add to that her soon-to-be impeccable manners and comely beauty, not to mention her exquisite musical talent, and she would be the darling and envy of all high society. John, by being himself, would rise to the top like cream. If he could keep from getting into any fights with powerful men, that is. If he killed the wrong judge or magistrate in a duel of honour, the emperor would have him shortened by a head. Perhaps the first thing to do was to take John to the imperial city and let him come to the notice of the emperor before he got in trouble with petty vain men, and let him acquire the imperial favour. That would protect him from lesser men. If they mixed in society in the imperial city, they would come to the emperor's attention sooner than later, if only because of the perfection of Zithrusa. Over the next 4 months, John and Zithrusa perfected their act. Wong was surprised that John had learned the aristocratic language so well. In fact, he spoke it better than some of the elite. Zithrusa was a treasure, a very high-class woman who would fit in among the very highest status wives. John sometimes had to teasingly take her down a notch when she got too into her role and was too snobbish to the caravanners in a polite and icy way. He grabbed her from behind and began sullying her hidden treasures under her robe while threatening to untie her sash. Her knees got weak and she pawed ineffectually at his hands, demurring, "Oh, please," as her yoni fluttered and juices dripped, coating her to her knees. Outwardly, she was able to maintain her demure demeanour, but inside she was on fire. Oh, what her John did to her. He moved his hands lower after giving her diamonds a final tweak and sought out her ruby. He found that her keyhole had a thick, carved wooden key in it already, and he twirled it back and forth between his fingers and sawed it gently in and out. Zithrusa gave a ladylike gasp and fainted in his arms, surprising him so he was barely able to keep her upright. He picked her up and slung her over his shoulder, and carried his plunder off to his den, where she revived and shed her ladylike ways, turning into a savage leopardess. The camels were nervous, looking around to make sure the deadly predator they heard wasn't about to attack them. The Caravaliers were used to the legendary John by now, and went about their business. "So when you say she turns into a leopardess, you mean?" trailed off the credulous drover. Wong nodded seriously and reminded the man, "Don't you remember back at that caravanserai right before the pass where we stayed 2 days? How he had to go and master a leopard? There was a reason they called on him to do it." Wong intimated without precisely stating. The man's eyes grew, and the mystery of Zithrusa grew. She noticed that she received much more respect in her own person, more than what would accrue to her for merely being John's woman, and she wondered a bit, but thought it was because of her new high-class manners. In a small town in the middle of nowhere, as she went to acquire necessaries with only Wong along for protection, she was accosted by an insistent drunkard, a soldier of middle rank who took her for a lady of easy virtue. Her high-class mannerisms failed to penetrate his fuddled brain, and he wouldn't leave off. Wong was helpless, as this was no danger to his mistress's life or limb, but Zithrusa was under no such constraints. She whipped out her sword, and kept the stupefied man off of her at risk of impaling himself, and when he even then persisted, perhaps drawn like a moth to the flame of her beauty, she flicked the razor tip of her sword 4 times, leaving parallel tracks down his cheek. He fainted in pain and surprise, or perhaps he just chose that moment to pass out from over-drink. When he revived, he had no memory of Zithrusa, nor of how he had acquired the claw marks on his face. But the men of the caravan put 2 and 2 together and added to the mystery that was Zithrusa. Wong just winked and put a finger alongside his nose, saying more with his mannerisms than he could have with words. Wong, who had a way with tiny devices, added a surprise to each of Zithrusa's fans and showed her the trick of it. When she pressed a concealed lever, 4 tiny metal claws sprang forth, and when the lever was pressed again and the fan closed, they were concealed again. Much more discreet than waving a sword about. John was like 2 different people. The 2 sets of mannerisms were so discreet from each other. The change in the way he dressed was accentuated by how he held himself, and if you didn't know him, you might not recognize him as the same man. It was good because they didn't really want anyone recognizing upper crust John as John the Procurer. It would hurt their status. John was more aggressive and put himself forward more, toyed with Zithrusa absently, which she loved, enjoying it in her own demure and coy persona. She was like an accessory, showing John to be a wealthy and powerful man just by how he treated her, so casually. He was so relaxed and proprietary towards this beautiful, dainty, refined treasure. Surely he was a man accustomed to wealth and power. They made such a good team. Wong, with his deferential attitude toward them, showed everyone just how rich and important they were also, the respect and honor in every fiber of his subliminal posture. People found themselves bowing to the pair as they passed, just because of the way Wong's posture and attitude screamed out how important these two honored ones were. It was quite fun. They practiced around the caravan, and even people who had known John for months and knew Zithrusa was a nomadic goat herd found themselves giving honor to John and his wife, who were working hard to be oblivious to the attention and take it as their due. Not as easy as it sounds, by the way. By the end of the caravan's journey, it seemed as if the rich couple that had been travelling with the caravan were independent and apart from the dangerous procurer in his vest and boots, who kept the company supplied with meat. Everyone just treated John differently when he was playing his high-class part. The caravan broke up in the city of Wuyi, or that is what it sounded like to John, who couldn't read the writing. He made Wong his secretary and asked him what the name of the town was, and Wong told him it was the town of Wuyi. Oh well, close enough. From here goods went by wagon, and there was no need for camels. Many roads parted ways from this point, and the Emperor's guards maintained the peace by draconian methods, obviating the need for guarded freight. It was the end of the line for the caravan master, or the beginning of the journey. It was the start of the caravan season, and he would trade his goods for the best deal he could get, of items which would gain the most value to the west, and set out again. John didn't ask the man if he was selling the nymph carvings, but instead they had a sentimental farewell, and John hired 4 porters and a palanquin for Zithrusa and rode the horse. Wong continued as drover to the camels, and they set out for the imperial city. Zithrusa failed as a dutiful wife when she complained about the horrible discomfort of the palanquin and made John ride in it for a day, much to the amusement of the porters. John cured their amusement by making each of them ride in it for a day, while he took their place carrying the ungainly torture device. They all stopped laughing one by one. John called a halt and disassembled the contraption, quelling the protests of the porters with a look. He redesigned it, reconstructed it, and invited Zithrusa to try it again. She was most unwifely and refused, suggesting that he ride in the palanquin if he insisted it be ridden in. John agreed and rode in it, and then had each of the porters take their turn. They didn't want to debark from their comfortable ensconcement and had to be spoken to sharply. Thus reassured, Zithrusa again essayed the vehicle and found it very comfortable now, with clever adjustments to be made to alter the degree of recline of the padded seat back, and a well to put the feet down in for vertical seating, which vanished when one wanted to recline fully. One could easily fall asleep to the gentle rocking produced by the now careful porters who, having experienced the difference a little care could make, were now proud to exercise it. On occasion Zithrusa rode the horse, blushing prettily whenever anyone glanced at her. John took these interludes to strip to the waist and take the place of one of the porters for exercise. After one of these sessions, he had Wong slip up to them checking for dust, as Zithrusa and John practiced with swords. John bludgeoned and hacked with his hardwood single stick, and Zithrusa diverted his blows and poked at him sharply. The reason the porters were menaced so intimidatingly was to keep them from thinking to rise above their station, just because they had been carried by a customer. The ploy seemed to work, and the porters didn't suffer from puffed egos. In fact, they seemed deflated. John was even so liberal as to let them sleep in the palanquin when it rained. John kept the porters beyond their usual distance by paying them handsomely, and when he hired the next set of porters, he bought their vehicle outright and gave it to the first set to replace the one he had modified. The second set of porters were puzzled, but had learned to ignore the strange whims of their customers. One palanquin was the same as any other, right? When possible, they stayed in a public house, more to keep up appearances than for comfort. They were used to the airy tent and found it more comfortable than a stuffy room with the possibilities of vermin. They tried to minimize that by having all the bedding removed from the room and providing their own. Slowly, changing porters every few days, they made their way deeper and deeper into the empire, towards the imperial city. The Eastern Emperor was often bored. He enjoyed adventure stories, but wasn't allowed to have any of his own. He was 17, and while he was allowed to learn the arts of war, he was never allowed to actually enter into battle. Besides, the Empire was mostly at peace. He had his personal spies out looking for adventure stories and exciting happenings far and wide, and they knew what he liked. One lucky spy who was richly rewarded brought him a carving of a strange sea creature, obviously not in the water but on land. It would look silly if it were not for the formidable fangs protruding from its pendulous upper lip. It looked so whimsical and fantastic, but the strangest part was that it had been carved by a man who lived in the middle of the desert. The Emperor sent a spy to learn more. The spy sent back reports of a man named John, who made strange carvings and won a contest among a gathering of nomadics by throwing knives. He had left before the spy had arrived, but the spy would try to learn more and to follow him. The Emperor had a knife maker make him some knives for throwing, and practiced fiercely and obsessively until the next report came in. It was a strange pair of gloves, of an orange colour, the Emperor had never seen before, except in flowers in the imperial flower garden. The gloves were warm and kept the hands dry, even when immersed in cold water. He had some snow fetched from a mountaintop, and the gloves kept the hands dry and warm, even when snow was piled on top and packed around for hours. The Emperor went back to throwing his knives, and took the wonder gloves out of their safe storage once a week or so, and wore them, or just held them in his lap and gazed at them. The spy sent every scrap of rumour and information he could find, and a strange story it seemed, just the sort to stimulate the Emperor's imagination. The man had been found as a stone statue in the desert, and a nomad girl had woken the statue up with the warmth of her nude body. He had learned how to speak her barbarian tongue, and had become a son to the headman. He had agreed to serve the headman for a year, and had carved the carvings. More carvings were included, of fish, whales, and strange bears. One carving clearly showed a bear swimming in the ocean like it belonged there. Such fantastic, unbelievable ideas. This man must be very interesting, thought the Emperor. One day, as the Emperor was meditatively throwing his knives, not really noticing that he was actually hitting his mark, a messenger brought a note from the spy, saying that the man John had served his year, and had joined a caravan as its hunter. He named the caravan master, and suggested he be contacted when he arrived in Hui, and questioned about John. The Emperor made the arrangements. The spy sent information indicating that John had somehow become a very proficient archer, and that he had joined the caravan by demonstrating his bow skill, and by wrestling a man twice his size using trickery and unknown moves. The Emperor switched from knife throwing to archery, and spent long hours trying to improve his already sufficient skill. He showed much improvement through fierce concentration and a calm mind. Not as easy to do as it sounds, by the way. He had wrestlers come from all over, using all different styles from Greco-Roman to sumo to the boxing wrestling of the Turkish clans, and asked them to demonstrate their trickiest surprise moves. He was actually not bored for a while. Also, when he was daydreaming and throwing his knife, he was not bored, nor when he was trying so hard to improve his archery. The one thing about being in civilization again, thought John, was the fact that there were establishments which cooked food and served it for a price. That was the other thing. There was money here, and everyone used it rather than barter. It somehow seemed wrong to sell his carvings for mere money, rather than exchanging them for goods, either needed or valued. So they sold 3 more tents instead. They hadn't spent all their time weaving, at least not tent panels. Zithrusa had an exquisite wardrobe of very fine robes suitable for wear to the most important events. Too good to wear for every day. So they had made clothing to travel in as well. They sold the tents for a fortune in tiles, and Wang made sure the conversion between silver and gold tiles was proper. The coins had a hole in the centre, and John made bars of wood to count and stack the coins on, locking them in easy to count. Easy to handle units, which could be better controlled than bags and piles. One would easily be able to see if any pilfering was going on. They had to change one of the silver tails for about 1,000, it seemed, little coins made of junk metal, but John guessed it was no worse than junk paper bills. The small denomination coins were so cheap they were only stamped on one face. The metal was so worthless they didn't bother to include methods to prevent debasing, like serrated edges or raised rims. At least they had holes in them to put a string through, and it only took a few to buy a meal or a room. No way was John going to let go much of value to gain these trash coins, though. He intended to keep his rubies and jewels, and to get gold and silver tails for any of what would formerly be barter or trade. Or more jewels, perhaps. The food was amazing, each meal was a work of art. The various eateries were like sports teams, striving to outdo each other, boasting on how much better they were than the other place, and each with their own fans, screaming the virtues of their favourite. It was alarming, and Wang had to outdo himself in order to maintain the respect his masters deserved. Once John had to brandish his Indian dagger in order to get a rusher for a competing eatery to shuffle off and let them enter their choice of eatery for a meal. When they later went back to try the other one, they were refused service on the grounds that they had been traitors by eating at the other place. John shrugged and turned away. It was all too cultish and crazy for him to deal with, except with violence if they pushed him much further. Wang recognised the signs in his barbarian master and tried to defuse the situation. No matter how good the food was, it wasn't worth this level of madness. Although, it was damn good food. The Emperor received another parcel from the spy, a bundle of arrows, 6 of them, with wide, thin triangular points. They didn't seem to be anything special, so he read the accompanying note. The man John had answered a challenge from a Scythian warlord, and had broken his sword, calling it a draw, split the warlord's 5 arrows in the target with his own, these, and called it a draw, ending by bringing down a goose in flight with an arrow through its head and called it a miss. Then the warlord had called for a drinking contest, an unmanly challenge worthy of a boy, humbly hoping your worthiness takes no offence. And when the challenge ended in a draw, the 2 men seconds called it a win for the warlord. The Emperor examined the arrows but couldn't see anything special about them. He then fired one, and was amazed at how true and straight it flew, almost leaping directly to the target even at the longest ranges. He called his armourer and asked him what he thought of the arrow, and the man avowed he could see nothing special about it. The Emperor had the man fire it, and he dropped the bow after loosing and exclaimed, "Magic! The arrow is enchanted!" The Emperor dismissed the man, and called for some wise men, who were used to examining and learning about strange and rare things such as the Emperor collected. After several days of examination and discussion, the men returned, bringing several new arrows they had constructed, and an old toy top that had been a favourite toy when the king was a boy, admittedly not so long ago. They had the king fire 2 kinds of arrows, and he noticed the difference in the flight of each kind, marked by a green or red stripe. The men explained, using the spinning top, how a spinning object was more stable and resistant to being pushed out of line of the axis of its spin. They directed the Emperor's attention to the slight angling of the feathers and the slight twist of the arrow head, showing how that would spin the arrow in the air, making it more stable in flight. The Emperor had them explain to the armourer how the arrows were built, and had the man produce or alter many arrows for him. When he next sought targets on the range, the young Emperor was quite amazing with his bowmanship. The caravan master was initially quite frightened when agents of the Empire accosted him as he was leaving Hui and informed him he was to attend the Emperor in the imperial city. He complained of his missed opportunity, the caravan season, his loss of income. The guards were unsympathetic, but one little man was responsive to his pleat and asked him what his year's gains were. He gave the figure and was informed that he would receive recompense in like amount plus half, and he shouldn't be required by the Emperor for more than 6 months at most. He was to bring all items relating to the man John. "Oh," groaned the caravan master to himself. What has that boy gotten himself into now? He gathered up his John artifacts, the perfect tiger skin, the blood-stained arrow, his precious carvings, the broken blade he had taken from the gaming field after the challenges of the warlord for a souvenir, a panel of the waterproof silk John had gifted him with in their farewell, the small eating knife he had found that was like John and Zithrusa's sword. He made arrangements for his camels, gave most of his men unpaid leave. One didn't become a successful trader without looking out for oneself, and gathered his personal effects. Off they went, day and night in relays, borne ever onward to uncertain end. The caravan master was somewhat reassured when he was shown into a palatial suite, most likely the only kind to be found in the imperial palace. Certainly there would be servants' quarters, but most servants wouldn't be ensconced within a suite of rooms, would they? The caravan master wondered nervously to himself. He was bathed, perfumed. He had really needed it too, after being hustled day and night without cease from Hui, and clad in sumptuous robes. Then he had to await the emperor's pleasure, an anxiety causing pause to be certain. Despite the uncertain circumstances, the caravan master was able to sleep, and he wasn't called to the emperor's pleasure until early afternoon of the following day. He knelt before a low dais in an informal audience room, head to the floor. A languid young man whispered in the ear of a bellicose and rotund man who acted as his amplifier. Whisper, whisper. His Royal Highness, the exalted protector and father of this great empire, descended from the holy loins of the goddess of the sun through... The man's voice fell silent instantly when the youth raised his hand. It was a much more powerful and natural display of body language, informing of importance and prestige, than that provided by Wong. The human amplifier wanted to object with every fibre of his being to his dismissal, but was simply unable to counter the emperor's merest gesture, indicating his imperial will. Another flick of his hand vanquished the man from the room. The emperor made a twirling motion with his finger, and all the imperial guards in the room did an about-face. He motioned for the caravan master to come closer and bid him sit on a cushion near the dais. The caravan master was overwhelmed by the honour but made haste to obey. "Tell me about the man John, how you found him, and what occurred then," the emperor requested. So the caravan master told the story as he knew it, how the poor nomads wanted to join his caravan, and the test he had set the owner of the enchanted bow. The results of that. The emperor called for a pause while the tiger skin was brought. The caravan master was quick to make a gift of it to the emperor, declaiming it was too fine to belong to any lesser man. The emperor examined it closely, finding no wound, and asked as the cause of such unblemished fur. Another pause, and the bloody arrow was fetched. The caravan master explained how his men found it within the body of the tiger, piercing his heart. The emperor examined the arrow closely and noted that it did not have the spin causing angle to its fletching. That reduced the range needed to make such a shot, and increased the bravery of the man John by any decrease in his marksmanship. Whatever the equation, the resulting answer was that John was a fine shot and a brave man. The caravan master continued his account, submitting how he had one of his largest men, who knew wrestling, enter the ring against John, and how John had beaten him soundly twice, using only a minimum of effort. There was another pause as a ring was built, and two wrestlers were choreographed in their parts while the matches were reenacted. A few small corrections by the caravan master, and the emperor was able to relive an historic event after the fact. He felt like he had almost actually been there. In his mind, he put himself in the role of John, and wondered if he would have had the same presence of mind, the same grace of action. The caravan master recounted how John had led the scouts to victory against an ambush, and acquired an amazing sword. The little eating knife was brought, and wise men examined it, and the broken blade from the challenge with the warlord. The sapients exclaimed over the two objects, stating that the sword had not in fact been broken, but sliced in twain. Look at the shiny surface, so different from a break. They broke the tip from the sword blade to prove their point. Using the little eating knife, they cut slivers from a brass bowl, They were very excited with their discoveries. The emperor let them take the knife with them to investigate further and shooed them out so he could hear more of the story. The caravan master recounted John's prowess at the hunt, taking the head of the desert auroch with his sword, which the emperor could believe, seeing as how that same sword had sliced through a stout scimitar, and bringing in many furs. He described the huge rack of the deer John had brought in, that it was more than twice as wide as he was tall. The emperor would have liked to have seen it, but alas, it was left in the brush beside the trail as useless to anyone, and a burden to transport. The caravan master reluctantly recounted the beauty and refinement of Zithrusa, knowing he could not hold back anything from the emperor, and the nymph carvings were fetched out. The servants who carried them laid them down reluctantly and lingeringly, necessitating disapprobationary hisses from their superior. The emperor asked the caravan master which of the dozen or more well-polished carvings were his favourite, and the crestfallen caravan master supposed that he would be allowed to only keep one, and the rest would be forfeit to the emperor. He selected his favourite, and was partially surprised and partially dismayed when the emperor took that one and waved the rest back into his custody. There was a pause, as the emperor had a servant hold the carving for his examination, careful not to touch it himself, although the power of the carving called for handling. He had noticed the effect they had on the caravan master and his servants. He resisted the carving's siren call and signalled for it to be put away in a sack and put it aside. The caravan master told of the help John had provided at the emperor's caravanserai, and that while he didn't know what had occurred, the outcome was the daughter of the local ruler marrying the captain of the outpost, ensuring much of the safety of the fort. He understood that the challenge had entailed entering an arena naked against a leopard, and that John had shown no marks of battle, yet had been declared the winner of the challenge. But that was all he knew. He mentioned that the captain had gifted Zithrusa with his horse as the caravan had left. The emperor made a note to ask for a written report under imperial seal from the captain. The caravan master explained how John and Zithrusa had doubled and redoubled their wealth, turning 6 shaggy ponies into 2 spirited western horses, and then turning the 2 horses into 2 caravan camels, how they made thread into waterproof silk, and then into luxurious tents of great worth. Another pause while the tent panel was examined, and the caravan master was compelled to make another gift to the emperor. The emperor noticed the caravan master's growing dismay, and presented him with a sapphire the size of a grouse's egg. The disposition of the caravan master brightened considerably. The sapients marvelled at the waterproof silk, and indeed it shed water. It was woven so tightly that it would be almost impossible to snag a thread. A very fine material, and of such an expensive colour too. The emperor had it put away in the treasury, as he had no current use for it. The caravan master thought that John and Zithrusa had many carvings, and they and their slave. Oh, had he forgotten to mention Wong, their slave? Wong was easy to forget, as he was always there, if that made any sense. Anyway, Wong drove the camels, helped weave the silk, and taught John and Zithrusa the language of the court. Yes, he thought that they both would speak fairly well, John better than Zithrusa. They had been practicing their courtly manners, guided by Wong. No idea how a camel drover could know courtly manners or the language of the court. More mysteries, most excellent. John's current whereabouts. Why heading toward the imperial city? To seek audience with the emperor. Probably passed him on the road, but no way of telling, in a closed palanquin going day and night. Should be arriving in about twice the time it took the caravan master to get from Hui to here. No idea how long it took, was in a closed palanquin, going day and night. My emperor. John noticed that they were waved past any roadblocks without even needing the usual bribe. It was as if they had acquired VIP status somehow. Perhaps Wong was causing it with his attitude, but in any case, their progress was hastened. As they drew closer to the imperial city, the porters seemed to get larger, stronger, and more professional. Their stride was almost military in its cadence. They were most attentive to duty, and seldom spoke unless in response to a question or command. Also, they traded out very frequently, maintaining a constant gliding trot that actually began to wear on the horse. A horse trader fell in love with the horse, soon thereafter and must have it, offering a fresh horse and too much money to refuse in trade. John thought the man a fool, or else he had designs on the horse's virtue, but in any case, John was enriched and acquired a fresh horse who could keep up the relentless pace of the porters. He had to insist that they camp every night, so he and Zithrusa could practice their leopard calls, or else the porters would have kept running all night. Wong suspected something was up, but he also didn't feel that whatever it was a threat to his masters. Time would unfold the weave of events to display the pattern soon enough. Wong would get up a few hours before the rest, and pack up most of the goods, and prepare breakfast. If it was a public house, he would pack up everything except his master's sleeping arrangement and hit the road, trying to leave a few hours earlier than John and Zithrusa. He had to continue on without pause, and try to catch up to them before full darkness overtook him. There was just no way the camels could keep up the pace of the porters, but they were used to keeping on, so eventually he arrived. The camels were forced to eat all night long with provided fodder, but they were able to eat in their sleep, so it all worked out. In a few days' time, they arrived in the imperial city, and were surprised when the imperial guards at the city's eastern gate, the Gate of the Sorrowing Moon, told them that their lodgings had already been arranged for, and a guide would be provided to show them the way. They waited a while until Wong caught up to them, and then they all followed the guide, the palanquin, John on his horse, Wong riding the lead camel, the last camel tailing behind. Or trailing, either one works. Wong soon became alarmed and confused. They were heading towards the imperial palace. There were no accommodations in this quarter. In fact, it was all bureaucratic offices, and the palace, of course. Still, the guide seemed to know where they were going, so there was no point in objecting since Wong didn't know where they were going. They all ended up at the imperial stables, where the palanquin was stored out of the way, and the camels were parked next to some snobbish and affronted horses. The camels ignored them, snubbing them hard. John's horse, it had become known as such when they traded Zithrusa's horse for it, seemed quite familiar with the setup, and seemed to already know the other horses as well. They secured their lower value raw materials, and had a bevy of servants who were even more invisible than Wong, gather up the rest of their gear and goods, and follow their guide into the guest quarters, where they were shown an elegant suite of rooms they were assured were for their use. No fooling, yes, sure it was meant for them, John and Zithrusa, and Wong. Dinner would be served in a few hours, a bath would be prepared in the adjoining room. The Emperor would see them tomorrow mid-morning. After dinner, there was a knock on the door, and there stood the caravan master, looking embarrassed and guilty. "Ah, John, my boy, I've already been here for a number of days chatting with the Emperor, and you have been the topic of discussion. He seems to have fixated on you, and you fascinate him for some reason. He will want to know all about you, and it would be best if you satisfy him in all particulars. Not a bad kid, if he could use some more seasoning. I just wanted to let you know that I have already told him everything I know, just so you know." The caravan master avoided looking at Zithrusa for some reason. She would have none of it, and walked up to the avaricious but good-hearted man and bussed him soundly on the cheek, bidding him welcome and expressing her gladness that he was here. "Of course, if the Emperor summoned you and asked you about us, you had to answer him," she soothed. "There is no harm in that, and we have no secrets from the Emperor," she finished. John smirked. "No doubt we shall be able to tell the Emperor more about ourselves than you were able to." He laughed. They offered him some fine plum brandy, and chatted a while, then sent him off feeling much happier about the whole situation, and retired to bed. Wong, of course, had been there the whole time, but he was practicing being unobtrusive, having been shown up by the palace servants. The Emperor looked at John and Zithrusa, seeing normal if very well-dressed people who wouldn't be out of place in any social gathering in Imperial City. He asked Zithrusa to entertain him, while John went and changed into his hunting gear. Her ergil was brought in, and John slipped off to put on something more comfortable. When he returned, the Emperor was reclined on his cushions, his face showing an ecstatic expression, tears running from his closed eyes. Zithrusa let the final haunting note fade, and after a long reverent silence, the Emperor gave a deep sigh and gathered himself together. "Beautiful, that was amazing, thank you," he said simply. "And you, man John, you are blessed to have such a mate. I have many questions for you. Will you sit and converse?" The Emperor had a list of questions he had thought of during his obsession with John. He understood how a good archer could make a bow seem magical in its accuracy, but how was it able to find the game? John laughed and said that when he had first found water in the desert, he had hallucinated a voice speaking words, putting a face on his subconscious, his inner self, verbalizing his inner knowing that the goats were not wild and probably had a herder watching out for them. Perhaps he had scented Zithrusa without being fully aware of it. Since then, his second vision quest without food for close to a week, he was more in accord with his inner awareness and allowed it to seem to be a voice that he could easily understand. He didn't know how his inner self could know where to find game, but it was seldom wrong. As for the tiger, he had been hunting in the area for a week. He would be a very poor hunter indeed if he didn't know there was a large predator moving into the area, despite being distracted by the caravan. The story he had told to the caravan master was an easy explanation, which didn't leave himself open to charges of witchery, placing all credit and blame upon his bow. "So you have given your inner self, who is more aware and knowing than yourself, a voice to speak to you with, and it is very accurate and aware," clarified the Emperor. "How very useful." The Emperor brought out the gloves and asked John about them. John excused himself, and returned wearing the suit that Zithrusa had found him in when he had first arrived in this place. John explained the properties of the suit, that it could preserve life in chilly waters for several days, and its colour was to make it easy for rescuers to find one in the vast open waters. He offered the suit to the Emperor as tribute, knowing it was how things were done. The Emperor was grateful to accept the suit which went with his gloves. Next, the Emperor wanted to know about the carvings. How could they be so magical they called people to touch them, made them yearn to possess them? John could only say that they were carved with love, and that art had a special power, just like the music Zithrusa had a special power over the emotions. He sent Wong to fetch the sack with the demon, and when he returned, Zithrusa averted her eyes as John showed the monstrosity to the Emperor. "This carving was an expression of my drinking sickness," John explained, and as anyone who looked at the grotesquerie found, it induced queasiness and ill-ease. He made a present of it to the Emperor, saying it was unfinished and should probably remain so. The Emperor hesitatingly accepted the gift, had it put back in its sack, and put away somewhere. Next, the Emperor listened to John's stories about where he was from and what his life had been like until it was lunchtime. They ate a fine repast and drank a new beer, which John limited to 1 glass as was his custom. Afterwards came the weapons demonstration, with the Emperor showing himself quite nearly as good as John at knife throwing and archery. John and Zithrusa demonstrated their styles of sword use, and Wong was induced to try to get his polished stick to the Emperor's neck. He was unable to do so, as the Emperor was too aware of people approaching his personage. It was a good lesson for Wong. His curiosity satisfied but not quenched. The Emperor asked John what he planned now. John explained that he wanted to go to India and get some rubber sap to rubberize silk so he could make survival suits and other wonderful inventions. Also, he intended to look for the source of his sword while he was there. It was wonderful stuff, this high-carbon steel. John realized that it was really layers and layers of high-carbon steel sandwiched between layers and layers of softer steel, but was calling it high-carbon to differentiate it from the usual medium-carbon steel most swords were made of. This was the first Zithrusa had heard of John's plans, and she needed to discuss something with him, something very important. The Emperor was a little strange. He wasn't sexually aroused by women. Neither was he sexually aroused by men, boys, girls, animals, feathers, flowers, muck, or any other substance. He might in the future become attracted to any of the above, but for now his pursuits were cerebral and innocent, if you can call wanting adventures, excitement, and feats of daring-do innocent, or cerebral, and not venial. John didn't know the actual meaning of that word, but used it in the way most people did. Prurient would have been a wiser choice. In other words, he had the emotional mind of a 10-year-old, trapped in a young adult's body. He wanted to go adventuring with John, but didn't know how to leave the heavy burden of command. Ha! He scoffed to himself. The empire ran itself, and he was just a figurehead, called upon to do nothing at all. They could replace him with an idol and it would work just as well. What was the use of having total power over an empire if you couldn't do as you pleased? The emperor bemoaned his terrible fate to himself, as servants flitted about attending to his every need almost before he could express it. "John, I am pregnant," said Zithrusa, unable to keep her terrible, wonderful secret anymore, now that she was certain. She inwardly cringed, not knowing how John would react. John was stunned, but he had quick reflexes, and knew that the quicker he responded, the better his life would be. So a very short time later, for one who has been suddenly bludgeoned with a surprising fact, he responded, "Honey, that is wonderful news. Are you certain? I love you," ejaculated John, correctly speaking the magical formula that every man should memorize, just in case it is ever needed. The second two parts can be interchanged, but never the first two parts. Very important. If you put the second part of the formula first, it can have disastrous effects. The very tense Zithrusa was suddenly like a rag doll whose strings had been abruptly cut, to mix a metaphor, and she started crying, a very normal reaction which often panics men. John instinctively did the right thing, and put his strong, protective arms about her, and hugged her gently with occasional fierce squeezes and kisses to the top of her head, not saying a blessed word, and not trying to find out what was wrong, which is a guy's first instinct when his beloved is sobbing. John was an amazing one in a million guy. Once Zithrusa was cried out, she tilted her red-eyed, snot-dripping, puffy face up towards John, who had never seen such a beautiful sight in his life, and blubbered, "But what about your plans to explore India and find rubber and steel?" Zithrusa started manufacturing liquids and visids from her face again. "All plans are as nothing in the face of this wonderful news. We will work things out, but for now, the only important thing is the welfare of our child," said John bravely, inwardly having some regrets he would never admit to, not even under torture. John took her to bed, really made a mess of her coiffure, and then told her how beautiful she was. She was very happy, and went to find some servants whose duty it was to pretty her back up. The emperor was glad to keep John and Zithrusa as house guests, and Zithrusa decorated his court, playing lovely music and looking amazing with her glowing beauty. And John played sports with the emperor, swords and wrestling and knives and riding horses. The emperor taught John much about horses, and John instructed the emperor in both styles of sword he and Zithrusa had developed. The emperor learned both, and was soon just as good as Zithrusa at the pokey style, and nearly as good as John with the sudden slash style. John entertained the emperor with a bedtime story every night, of various adventures and rescues and battles and treasures and escapes. The emperor held his plans close, refining them and waiting for the proper moment to implement them.